tale kicked off in a place that would freeze your bones. The guy flicked his hand, drew a long breath, and admitted he'd failed again, then snarled that if everything had gone right, he'd be wielding a super heavy sword with neutron star density. Staring into the scalding liquid, a cold doubt flared. Would he never master this magic? He realized he'd be forced to fight on hopelessly uneven terms. He slammed his eyes shut and drew another lung-searing breath, desperate to blast the thoughts away. He thrust his hand skyward, called up flight magic, and shot into the air, thinking maybe it was time to visit a crowded city he hadn't seen in ages, and suddenly 3 faces slammed into his mind. One of them stammered that he barely knew the area, another snapped that an urgent matter forced him to leave, the third proclaimed he couldn't die and had to go back for his family waiting in the village. He realized a loner had limits, and he needed companions. In the blink of an eye, the space right in front of him tore open, and a massive portal gaped inches away, leaving him stunned. His jaw dropped and he froze, a single shocked gasp ripping free as he stayed rooted, eyes locked on the portal, and croaked, "What could that possibly be?" A glowing magic circle snapped into being under his feet and yanked him straight toward the strange object. He suspected flight magic, but the thought died. He'd never had any trouble with that spell. With every step closer to the object, his curiosity roared, what had twisted the very fabric of time and space. Panic slammed him into a battle-ready stance. If the distortion began devouring everything around him, disaster was inevitable. Then, in that same heartbeat, a tiny hand shot into view, reaching out to grab him. Confusion seized him as he staggered back, hands snapping to his face and chest, and he blurted in horror, "What is this all about?" A girl's silhouette emerged from the curve on slow, deliberate steps. Then she shot out of the object in an instant, a soft smile lighting her face. Charm snagged him and a faint blush crept up his neck, but fear still lingered, so his voice trembled as he asked who she was. The stranger smiled and softly said, "Pleased to meet you. I'm Reseja, the goddess of invocations." She introduced herself and the room fell dead silent. The guy kept his mouth shut while she pinned him with a steady, smiling stare. Suddenly he spun away from her, chewing back a laugh. He couldn't believe she'd just crowned herself a goddess because it sounded wildly ridiculous, and the stranger watched with a calm smile. He choked back a laugh, cleared his throat, then asked the girl what exactly she was trying to say. She flashed a warm, apologetic smile, then dropped a bombshell. She was a goddess from another world, not this one, and she'd come to find a hero to summon. She flashed a grin, declared her arrival belonged beside the world's strongest, then locked eyes with him and asked, "Are you the strongest?" A chill tore through him as he wondered if this girl really meant to spin children's fairy tales, that a goddess chooses a hero to be summoned to another world. The god bellowed that these weren't fairy tales, and the guy froze, breath snatched away as those words answered the question he'd been turning over in his head. Cold, stabbing doubt hit him. Had she ripped through his anti-magic and read his mind? The man smiled politely, introduced himself as Exile, and boasted he was the strongest man in the world, then calmly insisted he was the strongest of all people. He locked eyes with the girl and dared to ask if she'd let him walk the hero's path beside her. Exile felt hope harden into resolve, certain that with her backing he could take on the perfect ones. The goddess beamed and asked, "Will you really come with me?" Thanking him with bright joy as she caught sight of his violent reaction. Exil's gut clenched with uneasy dread. Exile locked eyes with her and demanded, "What must I do now?" Exile declared that, by the king's orders, he had to defeat the demon king. Exile nodded outwardly but scoffed inwardly at the girl's absurd claim. Regia's smile flared as she jabbed a finger at the rippling distortion that birthed her. Then she turned to Exile and asked, "Are you ready for our trip?" He agreed before thought could catch up. Regia drove her hand into the distortion, and a harsh crackle exploded across the square. Exil's body crumbled, collapsing into a warped distortion, and the guy's muscles snapped taut as he felt his own flesh pull inward. He believed anyone who won't risk anything ends up with nothing, so he took the leap. Exile abandoned pointless resistance, closed his eyes, and surrendered to the current. A jolt skittered across Exil's skin, and his eyes snapped open to a cavernous hall where Raisha and a sea of people stood before him. Exile gaped at the scene, certain he'd stepped into another world. Behind the lavishly dressed man, Raisha shook her head, and the man turned with a smile to greet Exile. He flung his arms wide and roared that he, the country's king, had summoned the man to this place. Exil's eyes swept the room and landed on unfamiliar faces gathered beside him. Then it hit him. He wasn't the only one who'd been called. Exile heard the king snap, "Only 4 heroes summoned this time." The man shot back, "Exactly." The words hit Exile like lightning, and a cold truth snapped into place. He gaped at them. Their magical power was shockingly tiny for heroes, and he couldn't believe these barely powered fighters were the strongest in their worlds. Exile was itching to check their status when a grinning man from another world cut in, announcing he'd introduce new characters to the realm first, and Razel immediately decided to hear him out. He thundered that their world is home to three main races: humans, demi-humans, and demons, and that demi-humans are so rare they pose almost no threat to anyone else. Razel's blood ran cold. Everything so far matched his home world. The man's eyes hardened, and he snapped that demons were behind the whole mess. He warned that humans and demons had been locked in a relentless battle. The demons' strength suddenly surged, and now humanity lies in their iron grip. That's why they hauled them in: a conscripted hero, a civil servant, a fraud, a summoned hero, an adventurer, a realist, a summoned hero, a mercenary, a banza, as well as the summoned hero, unknown Razel. The guy grinned as he picked a side, remembering how he'd once hunted demons and honed his skills on them, while countries across the world flooded him with thanks. He dropped into a low bow and begged the heroes to join him in eradicating this evil race, insisting they must vanquish the demon lords so they could spend the rest of their lives worry-free. Fraudgrind's grin split his face. It sounded irresistible. Rial laughed, declaring it the perfect test of his strength. Banza snarled that these were the enemies of humanity, and he'd end them without a second thought. Rizel stayed silent. The maid glided in with a small tray, an object shrouded beneath a cloth. The man declared they'd first gauge everyone's current abilities, then, smiling politely, asked the heroes to place their hands on the crystal ball. They ripped the cloth aside to reveal the ball. The test would only score basic combat skills. The ball's formula couldn't check any specific detail. Razel stared. Were they really going to squeeze the amount of mana and the power of magic into cold numbers with some formula? That smug reel shoved forward to go first, cackling that he'd been called first, then instantly tapped the ball. A blinding flash ripped through the air, and Rial staggered, confusion searing her voice as she demanded, "What's going on?" A man barreled up to the balloon and yelled it couldn't be. Rio, baffled, asked what was wrong, but the man froze, words stuck in his throat. He couldn't say what was wrong with the adventurer's fighting strength. He cried out in admiration as the readout flashed Rial's combat strength, 4,097 units, an astonishing result. The rabbit beamed with delight, and the goddess let out a soft, breathy gasp of amazement. Razel stared, weighing whether this number was really that huge. The adventurer showed up, trailed by a slick Khan who pushed his glasses up and announced it was his turn next. He slammed his palm onto the sensor, and the readout screamed 3,664 fighting units. The man said the civil servant is terrifyingly strong too. Bonza, packing 3,776 units of combat power, was stopped cold. The man thundered that they could all fend for themselves. A grin split the man's face. "This is exactly what summoned heroes deliver," he declared. Then he swung to Razel and named the young man next in line. Razel nodded calmly and stepped forward. He closed in on the orb, obsessed with its failure to calculate that one crucial question, as every summoned hero's gaze pinned him. Bizarrely, the ball stayed inert, so Razel leaned in and quietly told the employee the balloon wasn't working. The man spilled a quick, awkward apology, forced a laugh that something was wrong with the subject, then peered closer and went pale with shock. The man spotted the burst balloon. Razel, eyes wide, blurted, "What's the matter?" The employee let out an awkward laugh, insisted everything was fine, and told Razel to try checking his combat strength again. He slammed his hand onto it. The man's face went deathly pale, and with a guilty, trembling voice, he told the king that the guy's fighting strength was 0 units. Rage cracked from the ruler as he roared, "Did I hear you right? The force was 0. The employee bowed his head and confessed, voice thick with shame, "Yes, every word's true," while the crystal lay untouched and flawless, not a single scratch. Razel lifted his hand in a careful, polite plea, desperate to call out this device that rattled him to the core. The king refused to listen, bellowed for Razel to leave, swore he'd never recognize anyone with 0 magic as a hero, and demanded Razel be gone from the castle at once, and the guy gaped in stunned amazement. He barked at the king to wait. An error had come from the 0, even though he could definitely use magic. He spun around, fearing there was nothing he could do. Then the fireplace's flames caught his eye and an idea popped into his head. Razel dropped to a knee, shoved his hand out, and snarled at the king to watch as he unleashed atomic reconstruction, a devastating technique that eats at least 7,000 combat forces and the perfect proof of what Razel can do. The employee screamed in stunned disbelief. The charcoal had actually turned into a diamond, and his hands shook violently with excitement. Razel grinned and asked the king how he felt. The guy snapped, "Do you understand now that I have magic?" And a furious man erupted, roaring how the guy dared act like that. The king erupted into a furious roar, snarling that no technology could turn coal into diamond, and the guy, stunned, demanded, "What do you mean?" Razel snapped that it was a common technique. The guy stubbornly assumed she could only exist in his world, and at that moment the king shoved the young man in the chest, roaring for him to stop and shut up while another man sneered, "Useless swindler, get out of my castle." Rial cackled, mocking how sad it was. Fraud slid his glasses up and smirked, calling it such a sad life. Banza stared, stunned that the guy had tried to trick them with a fake. Razel staggered, shock ripping through him as he hurled a desperate plea at the goddess. The guy was convinced. No one here actually knew this technique. The goddess glared at the man with icy indifference, leaving him dumbstruck and wide-eyed. The king thundered for the worker to call the guards, and the employee snapped to it, sprinting off. Knights thundered in, shouting at the guy to seize his stone. The king bellowed at Razel, "Don't you ever set foot here again." Then the man snapped and had the guy thrown out. Days had slipped by as Razel slumped on a city curb, stunned passersby threading around him, while a little girl pointed and asked her mother what was wrong with that silent man. She snapped at her daughter not to look at him. The girl blinked, baffled. Razel slumped on the fountain's edge, muttering, his voice raw as he wrestled with what to do next. Razel's memory slammed him back to the moment the king drove him out. He couldn't believe they'd tossed him aside so casually, and he sat seething with indignation at their audacity. In that instant he froze, silence crashing down. The other guy snapped his head up, enthusiasm crackling as he declared he had to change the subject. Razel bolted off, berating himself for not planning his next move, but for now he needed to nail down one thing. The young man stormed into the Tools and Weapons workshop, a place where purchases came only from the hands of visitors. Razel barely reached the entrance when a stranger shot him a grin and greeted him. Razel blinked, surprised he'd never seen the man before. The stranger tossed a gemstone onto the counter and asked the man if he could buy it, and the seller stood open-mouthed, stunned by the diamond's beauty. The man demanded to know why the guy hadn't taken it to the jewelry store. Razel shot back that the diamond was artificial. The guy feared trying to sell it to jewelers would get him accused of fraud. Razel leaned in and asked if any shops would take fakes. The man bristled, scowled, and snapped, "You're seriously joking with me, right?" He leaned in and dropped a bombshell. Had the seller ever thought of using jewelry in industry, like as a cutter or even as an image? Shock slammed into the man and he demanded, "What are you talking about?" The other shot back, "Sell that diamond to the jewelers and you'll live happily for 10 years. Razel gasped, saying he understood, and wondered if nobody in this world forged stones. He didn't expect trouble with the jewelers, so he waved the man off and demanded I name the country that treats diamonds with such contempt. Razel just wanted to sell the gem fast and snatch the cash, recoiling in disgust when he found it was artificial, while the other guy clicked his tongue in irritation. Razel exhaled heavily and asked the seller the price of a night's stay, and the seller smirked, saying the cheapest room went for about 10,000 shares a night. He exhaled, eyes distant, and said he understood. Razel then fired the question, what did he think of $70,000 for the diamond? The seller, desperate for cash, blinked in bafflement before erupting in a stunned shout at the young man's offer. Rage boiled as a man erupted, screaming about what the guy was carrying and demanding if this was some new kind of charity. Razel snapped no. He just doesn't want people to brand him a fraud if artificial diamonds ever become available. The seller froze, then snapped an adamant refusal, insisting they'd suspect him of cheating. Razel held his gaze in silence, then tossed out another option. He praised how much the man valued the diamond, drove home that the seller desperately needed cash, proposed a $70,000 deposit. The man agreed, saying the seller was probably in a tight spot. Razel thrust his hand forward and declared the deal sealed. The man gripped the young man's hand in a firm shake, sealing his agreement. The guy stormed out of the workshop as a man yelled for him to come back. Razel felt a surge. He finally had the money, even though it had taken longer. Razor's gut told him alchemy hadn't taken root here. The currency ran on completely different rules, and a brutal road stretched out before him. Mary's hotel lay hushed, every corridor holding its breath. The girl behind the counter snapped at the guy, "Leave now, no food." Razel inhaled like he was stealing the sky, groaned he was utterly exhausted, pressed a hand to his head, and cried that he'd been thrown into a completely strange world. He snapped his eyes open, and the first thing he did was drag his scattered thoughts into a hard, steady focus. He scoffed that she was a goddess from another world. She cast the interdimensional challenge. He'd expected only a brief displacement, but the magic here was miles apart from anything in Razel's home world. He shot upright in bed, disbelief exploding inside him as he realized he was in a parallel world. He flicked his wrist to fire up the quantum space analysis, and when the scans poured in, astonishment hit him like a physical blow. Razel gaped bewildered and demanded, what broke the laws of physics here? All around him, countless unknown substances crowded the ground. He crashed onto the bed, struck by how true it felt. Razel concluded everything he'd endured wasn't a stunt by the imaginary goddess, and he was sure the king's exile of him had blindsided her. It hit him like lightning. From this day on his mission was to save the world, and he had no idea whether slaying the Demon King would win the goddess's favor. After that, a fierce curiosity clawed at him. What kind of Demon King was this, really? Razel pictured the Demon King as a monstrous egotist, pulsing with magic, deranged and hellbent on burning everything, and he couldn't stop wondering if that raw power existed because nothing like it had ever appeared in his world. He flipped onto his other side, realizing this place was different. The demons were intelligent, all bound to a single ruler, and that train of thought snapped a guess into place. A dangerous doubt ripped through Razel. Maybe they weren't evil. He knew nothing about the situation here, and exiled, he couldn't count on anyone's cooperation. He flung off the covers and, smirking, glibly declared he'd decided everything and now knew what to do. He grinned, voice iron, and vowed he'd meet the Demon King in person. Razel doubted his world's magic could reach this place, tried it anyway, unleashed detection magic, and instantly a tiny window materialized in the air, flooding him with delight. A reconnaissance satellite blinked into existence before him, its onboard printer roaring to life and spitting out maps to scout the terrain. He flung a tiny device out the window, smirking that it would cause no trouble, then ordered the satellite to lock on and chart a course straight to the Demon King's location. Razel collapsed onto the bed, slammed his eyes shut, and told them he'd sleep while they plotted the route. Morning hit like lightning. At the first sunbeams, Razel's eyes snapped open. He blinked, stunned he'd slept straight through until morning. When he sat up, the route map was already spread out before him, and he stared, it's flawless. He snapped the card into a tight coil with a pulse of magic and ignited his detection spell at the same instant. Alarm ripped through him. Someone else was in the room. He unleashed high detection magic, and his vision ripped open, revealing shadowy figures hiding in his room, spying on him. Razel's eyes flicked across the group, 5 in total, and he wasted no time, casting a listening spell to siphon every scrap of their conversation. One of them pressed whether the other was certain Razel was holed up in this hotel. The other snapped there was no doubt. Razel assumed the king had sent them. He burst outside. The mercenaries dove behind the rooftop, eyes hungry. This was exactly the summoned hero they needed, the one the palace had cast out. Razel skidded around the corner and saw the king openly gunning for the guy. The mercenaries barked, everyone in their places. They ran the plan again, cold and sure. Slay the target, then return with his head as proof. Razel shot a quick glance over his shoulder, spotted Grin, the assassin lining up a shot, and instantly plotted how to turn that aim against him. Seeing no one nearby, the mercenaries dove into the operation. At the command, one of them plunged his hand into his pocket. He snapped open a tiny bundle and fired a dart straight for Razel's neck. Razel saw it and knew in a heartbeat it was a sleep toxin that would floor him in seconds, and that defensive magic could be used to deal with him. He faked a blackout and crumpled to the ground, mercenaries swarming his body as they declared the mission complete and said all that was left was to get rid of the evidence. A mercenary slammed his blade to Razel's throat and yanked him by the collar. Razel hissed out words about a quick reception. In an instant, the guy shot to his feet, stunning every mercenary in the room, then unleashed crackling lightning magic that left them wide-eyed and speechless. Everyone crumpled to the floor, shuddering from the attack, while Razel cloaked the room in a choking fog and said it was time for the mercenaries to get some sleep. He thrust his hand through the window, fingers hunting whatever lay inside. The guy guessed it must be in his inventory, and Razel pulled out the multifunctional stem cell he'd found. This cellular element is the blueprint for every clone. We needed it to duplicate him and supercharge his training, but he couldn't churn out battle-hardened clones on demand, so we sealed the element away for safekeeping. Razel's heart dropped. It might not replicate his powers, only mimic the look of his body, and the guy activated the cellular differentiation technique. The next moment, a hollow shell of a body snapped into view before him. Razel dove into the details, gouging in a bullet wound and getting him closed, while the man feared he might not even be allowed to live. After a while he finished, sure his spell had stitched the area back together, so he stepped aside and let the others handle the rest. Razel let out a weary stretch and grumbled that some unwanted work had shown up. Then he set his jaw and barked, "We're heading to the demon's lair." Night swallowed the city. The man sprawled on the floor, let out a ragged moan and stirred. Slowly the mercenaries clawed back to consciousness, groggy and stunned as they realized they'd been rooted and had no idea how. One whispered they'd blacked out, another guessed the target's defensive magic had snared them. Then one froze, eyes wide, and the others demanded, "What is it?" Razel's body lay on the floor before them. They stared down and spat, "He's dead." Rage exploding from him, the mercenary shouted they'd just wasted their time, hurling curses at the man. Then he whipped his sword in a flash and cut into the man's body. The mercenary whirled to the others and barked, "Take the head." They snapped to the order and said, "Time to go." A cluster of figures melted into the shadows, abandoning Rizzle's body sprawled dead in the middle of the narrow alley. Night had fallen, a giant moon loomed over the shadowed castle as Razor fixed his gaze and whispered it was probably a demon stronghold. Two knights stood guard at the big gate when a lone figure suddenly strode toward them. They erupted in stunned shouts, screaming for the stranger to stop. Knights jabbed their spears across Razel's path, sealing him off. They barked for him to stand still, calling him a man, and Razel, a little surprised, blinked as they demanded what he was doing here. Razel shot back that he wanted to speak with the Demon King and asked the knights to bring the guy to him, leaving them staring at one another in stunned disbelief. They raised their spears again, pinning him with cold steel. They lit into Razel with curses, and the knights snapped. Do you really think a man could lay eyes on the Demon King just because he needed to talk to him? Razel threw up his hands in bafflement, offered a sincere apology for the sudden visit, and vowed he'd arrange a business meeting. His behavior left the knights utterly shocked. They exploded, shouting they'd never let someone stage a business meeting just to meet the Demon King. The knight barked for everyone to look at the man's clothes first and hammered home that he's a hero. Razel yanked the spear from his face and shot back that he was indeed a hero. The king had banished him, and the knight itself froze in shock, all eyes on the man who just revealed his exile. He pressed on, dramatic and breathless, insisting that this morning he, too, had nearly been killed by the king's agents. The knight itself recoiled, stunned as word of the assassin spread. Razel's voice dripped with pity as he exposed the true nature of man. Beaten by all he'd lived through, he said siding with the Demon King didn't seem so strange, then turned to the knights and asked if they agreed. The knight leveled his weapon at him again, driving a tight, ragged sigh from his chest as he roared that everything was exactly as before, quoted a fellow hero, "An enemy's enemy is a friend," and swore they'd never repeat that mistake. Razel's brow tightened. He thought this was a problem, and insisted the strategy had already been used. The man guessed brainwashing magic was one option, so Razel shot a finger up and declared he'd change his question. He jabbed at the castle's crown and sneered, "Is that pitiful scrap of a barrier crowning the tower?" The knights froze, stunned into silence. One of them blinked, baffled, and blurted, "What was that just now?" While the second snapped, fury crackling in his voice, "Did he just call me pathetic?" The knight exploded with fury, roaring that some fool dared to mock the demon lord's painstakingly forged, omnipotent, all-encompassing barrier, and the second knight jittered in panic, yelling to his friend, "Remind him, it's not worth talking about." Razel beamed, stepping forward to thank the knights. The guy's breath hitched as reality crashed in. He was really here. The knight froze in shock while he cringed over what he'd blabbed. He slapped on a confident smile and played it off as nothing. The knight taunted that if the guy thinks he can get through the barrier, he'd love to see it, and the second knight, baffled, tried to call out to him. Razel winked at the knight in agreement, flicked his finger, and the guy, who hadn't expected he'd need strong teleportation magic for a barrier this powerful, felt a seal explode into being under his feet. He locked eyes with the knights and vowed they'd meet again as his body began to unravel into thin air, leaving the knights speechless that he was serious. Razel's body unspooled into vapor and vanished. The knight held its breath, baffled by what it had just seen. They stood frozen as the man before them blinked out of existence. Razel shattered into a spray of tiny molecules that hurtled toward a looming tower, where the guy's body snapped back into being. He stormed into the Demon King's chamber, instantly aware of where he stood, and his next move already locked in. Then a voice suddenly called out. The stunt girl jabbed a finger at the guy inside, pushed herself up from the throne, and, voice cracking with shock, demanded, "Who are you?" Razel stared at the girl, stunned. She outclassed the gate guards 100-fold and moved like a battle-hardened veteran. She screamed, stunned to find a man here. "It can't be," she cried, pressing him. Did he really mean the barrier hadn't held? Razel snapped that if she was the one who set the barrier, he had something to say. He grinned and suggested he should just call her the Princess of Darkness. She stared, baffled, and demanded, "What did you just say?" She smiled, serene and sly, declaring herself the Princess of Darkness, then demanded who the stranger was and why he dared be here. Razel bowed and apologized to the princess for passing through her barrier without a minute, and at that moment she screamed in surprise. Razel snapped he'd be livid if he wrecked the girl's hard work. The barrier was intact, so the guy pleaded with the princess for forgiveness, and the girl, awkward and incredulous, said the fact he got through the barrier was utterly ridiculous. The Princess of Darkness sprang from her seat, her eyes darting to pin down who the man was as suspicion, and anger coiled in her over his unknown purpose, and in that instant he brought a hand to his chest. Razel stepped forward, introduced himself to the princess, and declared he'd originally been sent to this world to be a hero. He confided to me that he'd been expelled by certain circumstances and now belonged to no side, then told her he'd come to ask the girl about this world. His words sent the girl into a stunned stupor. The young man locked eyes with the Princess of Darkness and vowed he'd ask her one last time. He asked the girl, "Will you answer my questions?" Right then, dark energy surged around her and shadow claimed her face. A glowing seal erupted beneath the princess's feet. She snapped into a fierce explanation that the hero had actually come asking about exactly that. Then she lunged at the man and roared, "Don't you dare joke with me." Razel glared at the seal beneath his feet, teeth clenched as he cursed under his breath. He'd probably chosen the worst way to meet the princess. He snapped his hand up, conjuring a tiny seal at his side. The next moment the wall beside him exploded, hurling the girl into an attack as she lunged and cried, indignant, that he was an impudent man. Razel planted his feet and answered with calm steel, but a bitter truth gnawed at him. He had no proof he'd come here by his own hand, and not as a proclaimed hero. The Princess of Darkness loomed amid the rubble, a column of dust whipping around her, and with a wicked grin declared the guy was smart enough. He locked eyes with her, both frozen in the same pose, as his mind raced to find the next move. Raisel snapped to a sudden clamor as two demons burst into the room, and the girl, voice trembling, rushed to her majesty. "Are you all right?" The demons snapped to attention the moment they spotted the intruder, and one man demanded, "Who is he?" while locking his gaze on Razel. The Princess of Darkness roared for her subjects to fall back, admitting her attacks simply couldn't touch him. Razel realized their ability barely hit about 80% of the girls. The guy bellowed to the princess that their attacks weren't working. The demoness beside him snapped not to panic, reminding him they're the royal guards. No matter how brutal it gets, their mission is to eliminate this guy. Razel swept his gaze across the room and chose not to prove he was harmless. Killing these two would be a direct strike against the Princess of Darkness. Razel snapped his head up, decided it could pass for a threat, then waved his hand at the demons. They flinched, recoiling in stunned surprise. With a single flick of his wrist, the young man conjured a colossal seal and vowed he'd make them believe that talking things over peacefully was the best solution. In a heartbeat, the demon and the demoness stopped dead in astonishment as the Princess of Darkness cracked into panic and screamed Jack and Zarina's names, tears streaking her face. Zarina let out a strangled sigh that flipped into a gasp as a red streak of blood raced across her neck. Razel was feverishly working the seal. A roaring stream of energy engulfed the Princess of Darkness servants, coiling around their wounded necks as flesh knitted shut and their wounds healed. Zarina sighed, bewildered and unable to fathom what had just happened, and Jack clutched his neck, blurted that he was sure he'd just been beheaded. Tears streaking her cheeks, the Princess of Darkness cried out, "Have we just been reborn?" Razel snapped that he'd never meant to kill them, and the girl, bewildered, started babbling about her servants' necks. Razel let out a dismissive sigh and called their panic overblown as the demons froze in a stunned stupor, while a man taunted that they'd honestly thought they were doomed just because their head was flying through the air. The Princess of Darkness jabbed a finger at the guy and roared that he was the strangest here, insisting no spell could let anyone survive after losing their head. Razel blurted, awkward and unsure, asking if sinking into politics had dulled their magic, then brushed it off saying no one would dare criticize the Princess of Darkness. Zarina snapped, furious, scolding him because Her Majesty is the Lord of Demons and the strongest. Just then the Lord himself cut through the chaos. She squeezed her eyes shut and barked, "Stop, Zarina." Razel hung on the princess's every word as she declared the man utterly beyond their comprehension, demanded they stop talking like that, watched Zarina freeze into silence, and heard Jack call out to Her Majesty. The Princess of Darkness strode up to the young man and pressed Razel to confirm he'd come here to learn about this world. The Princess of Darkness shot the guy a nervous smile and nodded. "Ask anything," she said. Razel's voice surged with relief as he replied he was glad the girl was finally ready to talk. Zarina burst in, practically buzzing, insisting they still couldn't be sure he wasn't the enemy and urging everyone to brace for trouble. But the princess just smiled, cut her off with, "We'll see when the time comes," and Zarina felt like giving up. The princess's servant spun anxiously toward the girl, and the princess snapped that, rather than keep taking bruises here, they had to forge a plan to seize even a single ray of hope. She sneered that she'd attacked first anyway, then declared a fierce hunch. If they laid everything on the table and talked it through, he'd flip and join their side. The Princess of Darkness smiled and waved the servants out, declaring there was nothing to fear. Razel expelled a long, shaky sigh. It's been tough, but at last everything looked like it would settle. When Princess Zarina spoke, the two Jacks shot each other a quick glance, nodded, bowed, and vowed to obey. Her wish was their law. A heavy, awkward silence swallowed the room as the demon princess sank into her throne and crossed her legs with lethal calm. She shot Razel a wicked smirk and invited him to ask anything he wanted. He returned a polite smile and thanked her for the chance. He sank to his knees and blurted he'd heard the human race was about to be swallowed by a rapidly swelling demon horde, asked if it was true, and the demon princess, calm as a still lake, said it wasn't. Razel stared at her, disbelief burning, and demanded what was wrong with those words. The girl let out a long, defeated sigh and snapped that absolutely everything was wrong. First off, the demons haven't grown stronger in centuries. They're weakening, not powering up. They never even dreamed of controlling people. Humans are the ones forcing harsh conditions on them. The demon princess whipped out a neat, rope-tied document and hurled it at Razel, ordering him to read it. Stunned, he snatched the paper midair and demanded, "What is this?" The princess declared the papers a binding contract between humans and demons, and Razel felt royal magic pouring off him. The girl declared, cool as ice, that he clutched the original papers. Razel staggered, baffled, and demanded whether she was telling the truth. The princess stayed calm and confirmed every detail was exactly as she said. He opened the paper, his face a grim mask, and dove into the words written inside. Words spread like wildfire. Commit a crime on the demon border, and human law will drag you to judgment, and no one will shoulder the blame if a demon is hurt while walking among people. Horror ripped through Razel as he demanded how she could have sealed such a monstrous contract, and the girl's face went cold as she revealed that, just a few generations ago, a hero had slain the demon king. She vowed the strongest demon always rose to become lord of demons, and when the demon king fell, the truth hit. Nobody could defeat the hero. The princess snarled that if they defied her demands, the hero would seize her throne and slaughter the girl. She had no choice. Razel locked eyes with her and said he understood her logic, then dropped into a heavy silence, watching her hands tremble as his mind raced. Razel's jaw dropped. Why pull him here when a towering hero already stood guard? He threw out a theory. They summon a new champion whenever the last one dies, yet strange inconsistencies kept gnawing at that idea. He locked eyes with the demon princess and dared, "Can I ask you something?" She snapped upright and shot back, "What do you want to know?" Razel shot a sharp glance at the princess and cut in, "Is the hero alive right now?" The girl blinked, surprise flaring across her face. Her breath hitched and she snapped, "He's alive." She snarled she'd have shredded the contract if not for this hero, and Razel shoved the parchment into her hands and demanded, "Then why drag him here?" She gaped, disbelief in her voice. "You were expelled earlier." He met her eyes and shot back, "Yep, exactly. I don't see what's wrong with that." The princess grinned and declared that fortune had favored Razel. He'd barely slipped past death itself. The man went rigid, eyes wide, and demanded, "What does that mean?" The girl spat out that he'd been summoned into this world to be used as a victim. The words hit him like a blow, his face drained of color. Moonlight wrapped the demon king's castle in a suffocating hush, and in a single heartbeat, the world snapped still around one person. She sneered that people like him were called victims. His face drained of color as he stammered, "What does that mean? Tell me more," and she pressed a hand to her mouth, folding everything inward. The demon princess dropped her gaze and launched into her tale. The girl revealed it began about 600 years ago, when the very first call of the hero rang out. She scoffed that he likely hadn't been that strong back then. He was no match for the four heavenly kings, Jack and Zarina's parents. Razel's eyes widened when he realized the strongest were the parents of the two he'd just showcased his skills to. She proclaimed every hero that followed would be equally powerful. The high ranks staggered and immediately dubbed the goddess who summoned the mightiest champions. Razel exhaled, conceding that it had all led to what came next and that it was an unbearable hassle. The demon princess agreed, then froze, eyes wide, and cried out in astonishment, "You knew all this yourself." In that instant, Razel's mind snapped alive. Someone in this world could still forge that magical artifact, and that possibility eclipsed every other theory. He locked eyes with her and demanded whether the goddess had a hand in forging those magical artifacts, and the princess, briefly caught off guard, dropped her gaze in frustration and snapped that it was obvious. Razel mulled it, then shot out that the first hero had been far stronger than the first demon king back then, and the princess, hearing it, bared her teeth viciously. The first hero smashed the demons, sparking a wave of summoned champions who pulled more fighters into the fray, and when their strength finally snapped, they willingly let that original hero tear them apart and devour them. She snapped that after that everything would loop endlessly, and that the first hero is right now stronger than he's ever been. She relayed the king's admission that they never suspected the demon king might appear, declared that's why they forged the strongest hero to fight on Razel's side, and couldn't shake how shockingly easy it was to picture. The demon princess drew a stormy breath, lifted her chin and sank back into the throne. The girl insisted, "That's all I know." Razel's mind snapped into focus and he declared he understood everything. If that was true, the goddess and that hero were his enemies, and he'd come here to secure a favor from the goddess. He saw it coming. She planned to sacrifice her assistant, and in that instant, the option evaporated. He shot to his feet and asked the princess for permission to test her tail, and she blinked, briefly bewildered, then pulled herself together and said she didn't mind at all. Rizel shot his hand up. A crisp info window blinked to life on his palm as he set his sights on pulling evidence from his satellite analysis. She leaned in, eyes locked on the uncanny force, certain it was detection magic, but utterly clueless what he hoped to do with it. At that moment, crisp, marked paths blazed across the Rizel screen, and he realized every soul no longer looked human at all. The guy whispered he'd unearthed traces of a magical artifact and the first hero inside the palace, proving the demon princess had been right all along. Shock slammed into her. She demanded what it meant and how he'd even managed to scout the palace's situation. It was incredible. Rizel spun around with icy calm and declared, "Easy, hand me everything I need and I'll tear through that analysis." The princess threw herself back onto the throne and declared it exquisite, casually saying she'd like them to have something like this too, while the girl gaped, stunned that Rizel faced absolutely no obstacles. She pouted, voice cutting, and asked, "I've felt from the very beginning that you didn't need me at all, is that the case?" Rizel's voice was ice calm, as she confirmed it was exactly so, admitting that without her, he would never have suspected the first hero still hid in the palace. He ripped his gaze away and admitted he'd never have known he was going to be a victim. Rizel smiled and sincerely thanked the princess for telling him about it. She recoiled, eyes skittering away as her cheeks burned scarlet, then insisted it was all just small things. Rizel fell into a cold silence, plotting that if he ever met the goddess, he'd force her hand to send him back to his world, the surest way to make this terrible man worry. He was convinced the first hero could be taken hostage, but he also knew that wouldn't help the Princess of Darkness. Then he gasped and shouted that he understood everything. Rizel snapped to face the princess, his sudden intensity rattling her so she shouted, "What's wrong? What do you want?" He smirked faintly and dared, "Do you want to defeat the first hero with your own hands?" The girl froze in that instant. The princess suspected the man had struck the same dark pact and butchered his ancestors, and she declared that killing him was her life's burning obsession, an opportunity she, heir to every lord before her, would never let slip. The princess locked eyes with the guy, jaw hard, and fired back with iron resolve that she wanted it. Rizel flashed a smile and said everything was settled. Rizel leaned in, asked if she liked his proposal, vowed to train her himself, left the princess completely baffled, and guaranteed she'd soon eclipse the hero's strength. She stuck out a tiny, stubborn pout and awkwardly fumbled, "Why are you going so far?" Rizel closed his eyes and, without a beat, told the girl he just wanted to return to his world. He'd have to start making tough decisions to do it. The Princess of Darkness gaped at the guy, admitting it's the truth and that he too has a purpose, when the girl awkwardly blurted, "Where did you get the idea I'd become stronger than the hero?" And that question knocked him flat. Rizel shot back to the girl that their strength was only 1/5 of his, and he said it dead serious. This was a level they could reach if they actually pushed themselves. She shot him a doubtful look and snapped that 1/5 sounded brutally difficult. Rizel sprang up from his seat and thundered, "Are you the strongest of your race?" The guy vowed that if she studied, everything would fall into place. Rizel smiled and said it would get easier the moment the girl discovered her weaknesses, and the princess let out a thoughtful murmur. She shot to her feet, strode up to him, and said, "If you insist, I'll agree," her voice ringing with iron resolve. Rizel smirked at the princess, catching that she was deliberately leaning in. The Princess of Darkness and the hero clasped hands. She grinned, pleased to join forces. The guy warned they'd use a teleporter and told her to be ready, and the princess, voice trembling, asked what that meant before pleading they not use it. She pressed trembling hands to her face as panic tightened its grip. Then Rizel cut through the haze. "Do you know anywhere you can practice?" And his question yanked her back to her senses. Rizel snapped that he wanted to test what the girl could do. The princess paused for a heartbeat, then pointed to a square a few kilometers away. The guy flung the map open in front of her. She jabbed a finger at a spot and insisted it had to be here, and Rizel whispered the words he prayed would get them in. Rizel wrapped his arm around the princess's shoulder and urged, "Hold on tight." She looked up, a flutter of excitement in her voice asking if they'd really fly that far, and Rizel grinned, confirming it was true. A massive sorceress seal flared up beneath the princess and the hero's feet. The girl screamed in panic that she wasn't mentally ready yet. Their bodies rapidly dissolved into shimmering particles that shot toward the right place, and the princess screamed loudly at the sight. After a while, they finally reached the designated spot. The place lay nearly deserted. The Princess of Darkness clung to her last scrap of strength, hunched over and gasping, her head bowed. Exhaustion crushed her. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, stunned by magic that hurled them the whole distance in an instant, while Rizel met her with an awkward, apologetic look. The princess jolted upright and, voice ragged, insisted nothing was wrong, then turned to the guy and demanded what kind of thing it was. Razel told the princess it was a magical barrier, a mirage. The girl blinked, bewildered, asked what that was, and the guy grinned, saying from the outside it just looked like they were doing exercises, which only made her even more confused. He grinned and promised no one would ever glimpse her shame. Stay calm, he said, and the princess forced out a grudging thanks for his care, thinking, so this was his plan. Razel proclaimed the girl battle-ready. The princess, momentarily startled, whirled around and answered with a steady, determined yes. The Princess of Darkness pinned the laid-back guy with a fierce stare and vowed they'd unleash their full strength this time. Razel grinned and announced they could start the fight. The girl fixed a resolute stare on the hero standing before her. She sprang to readiness, picturing how the guy would strike, vowed she had to stop him, then hesitated and let herself consider that skipping the attack might be the wiser move. In an instant, the man who'd been standing before the princess vanished. She froze, confusion gripping her, eyes snapping open as she blurted, "Is the young man gone?" The Princess of Darkness planted herself, sensing magic crackling through the air, a dispelling force, she realized. Blind attacks would fail, so the girl forced her focus, knowing that even if she wavered, one spot still thrummed with deeper magic. In that instant, she snapped her eyes open, clicked her teeth in displeasure, and froze. Something had caught her eye. The girl whirled, cast a spell, and shouted that he was here. At that exact instant, a small stone smacked the princess's head, forcing a soft cry from her as she stared down at the pebble now lying nearby, wondering what it was. She peered closer and realized it was just an ordinary ball, then clutched her head, wincing at the sharp pain. The next moment, Razel appeared behind her, announcing the ball would vanish in 3 seconds and telling her to try to dodge him. The princess spun around, certain it had to be telepathy. Razor smirked and confessed he'd used no magic, only amplification, and the girl's jaw hit the floor. Her hand snapped into a white-knuckled fist of indignation as Razel grinned, saying he expected something interesting from her, and cheering her on with hungry amusement while she seethed, vowing she'd kill him. Rage boiled in the Princess of Darkness. She bared her teeth and snarled she'd definitely dodge it. Razel smiled and darted past the girl, and right then the ball smashed into her head again, forcing a scream. Hours had bled away since training began, the sun slipping low over the horizon, when the princess snapped her arm up and slammed a perfect block against the hurtling ball. She was drenched in sweat and bone-tired, replaying how she'd somehow defended herself when the guy praised the princess. Razel barked for her to attack now, and she froze in stunned disbelief. The Princess of Darkness locked onto the man, every muscle primed to strike. She traced his movements, but her vision lagged, and when he deliberately slowed, it only tightened the cold dread coiling in her chest. Calm settled over her, and she exhaled in a long, cleansing rush. The girl figured she'd have to apply something else, and Razel's gaze locked onto something instantly. The Princess of Darkness threw her arms wide, her eyes sliding shut as a legion of seals closed in around her. Razel locked onto it, sure it was fire arrows. He hissed a quick curse and vowed to raise another barrier just in case, while the guy whipped around and clicked his tongue in displeasure. The Princess of Darkness drew in raw power, whipped a sideways strike, and screamed, "Hit her." She panted with a wide grin and asked the guy how he felt. Razel froze in confusion as fragments rained down beside him, and the guy's eyes snapped to a gaping hole at his side. His barrier lay shattered. The girl panted fiercely. The princess's grin split her face as she cried triumphantly, "I've finally succeeded." She crumpled to the ground, gasping that she was exhausted as the barrier kept crumbling, and Razel's fists clenched. Did she really think his defenses were so weak he couldn't stand up for himself? He'll have to wrench extra power to conjure the barrier invented by ancient magicians, and he won't let a shred of weakness or inexperience show. He'll unleash everything to prove the true height of his magic. Gasping for breath, the Princess of Darkness doubled over as he strode up and thrust out his hand, a simple gesture that froze her in stunned disbelief. She snapped up his help, shot Razel a daring smile, and asked them to start. The guy, burning to test the Princess of Darkness's limits, matched her grin and agreed since she insisted. Razel spat the command, and a shimmering barrier snapped into motion. The princess suddenly cut him off, shocking him, and voice ragged, she shouted that she needed to rest again. They sank down to rest. She spun to him, eyes blazing, and demanded, "What kind of barrier are you talking about?" Razel flashed a grin and vowed to conjure a small dome, daring the girl to shatter it with her magic. The girl glared at the guy, daring him about the small dome and snapping if he really thought she couldn't. Razel wrapped himself in a crackling barrier and snarled that she would prove it to him. Ryza stood encased in a glowing dome. He grinned and told the girl the barrier stopped any magical attack cold. The Princess of Darkness flashed a wicked grin, amused that this man dared push his luck, and coolly said she'd remember his words. She slammed down a colossal seal and snarled, "You underestimated my strength." Right then, the Princess of Darkness unleashed a devastating attack that rocketed straight at the guy surrounded by a barrier. Her attack slammed into the barrier and died before it could touch him. She gaped, breathless, and shouted, "Is this barrier actually blocking magic?" She planted herself in front of him, utterly silent and razor-focused, watching as he stayed perfectly still, unmoved by her attack. Razel ripped off the protection and hissed, "You really think I'm joking?" The girl spat back in disgust. "Since when did you get so brave?" Big deal, she couldn't do it the first time. The Princess of Darkness whipped away, shoulders slumping, after the man shouted for her to stop sulking, leaving him baffled as she, tears spilling down her cheeks, rasped, "What do you want?" Razel faltered awkwardly, blurted an apology, and admitted to the girl he still didn't know her name. The Princess of Darkness snapped, displeasure blazing as she asked if he was only now deciding to find out. She agreed, owning up that it was her fault too, introduced herself as Mercia, Princess of Darkness, then fixed him with a grateful stare and thanked him for volunteering to help her. Razel flushed and mouthed a shy "thank you" for her trust, pleasure buzzing through him, then snapped, "If we're serious, we switch to merciless skills." He sneered that her magic was off the charts, but her technique was embarrassingly sloppy, so she only landed weak attacks at the exit. She stared, completely lost, and begged him to explain it in simple words. Riesel barked for them to picture Mercy's magic as a pump. Force is the hose's thickness, technique is the water's pressure, and the magic circle is the outlet skill, so it can only take so much pressure. He hoped that finally explained why she couldn't attack, and the girl agreed. He held up a man and a dragon as an example. The dragon towered in power, so the monster's win looked certain, but sharpen the man's magic a notch, and the dragon buckles under a precise assault, collapsing as the man rises triumphant, crowned the strongest magician. Riesel snapped, plain and simple. "You need training to learn how to channel your magic and lock onto your target," vowed to teach her everything so she could take down the most powerful monster and demon, and she shot back, "I'm ready," then demanded to know what she'd need. He told Mercia they'd start by conjuring a three-dimensional magic dome. The princess eagerly echoed his words. Razel braced himself. He'd have to push hard, and he realized the girl still hadn't grasped something crucial. He declared magic domes come in different shapes. You can craft a flat, fragile one, but Riesel vowed to teach her to build a three-dimensional dome equal in strength to infinity, turning merciless magic into a three-dimensional force. The princess froze as realization hit. This was an entire science she hadn't imagined. She whirled on the guy and demanded if her skills could keep growing forever, and Riesel's satisfied grin confirmed she was right. Mercia scoffed, eyes narrowing. How was she supposed to retrain in a flash and learn to conjure that dome? Could the guy actually shave time off their whole course of study? Razel shot back he'd have to keep working. She knew he wasn't born a prodigy at this magic. It had taken him years to get it right, and Mercia snarled she wouldn't wait that long, calling him boring. She warned she'd fire a question at him next. The girl demanded why the guy agreed to train her. Mercia snapped his goal was completely different. He wants to return to his world. So she shot back. Why couldn't they just kill the hero and take what they need instead of complicating the training? Rise will agree. He declared she was right, said he had two reasons. First, the information he could gain. Second, that the girl might see him as grateful she'd let him see the truth. Then he decided to add one more thing. Razel dropped a bombshell. After the victory, he wanted the girl to follow him into his world as an adventurer, and the Princess of Darkness froze, stunned. He vowed to give her the time she needed to decide on his proposal. Mercia hollered, confused, "What does that mean?" Razel warned there's one enemy in his world who's brutal to beat and his strength falls short, so if they join forces they might have a shot to get rid of him. A guy helps a girl and she helps him back. Simple, Mercia asked. Are you going to defeat a creature twice as strong as you? What? It should have been impossible, yet Razel spun to the girl and said her fierce determination and relentless perseverance had finally given them a chance. He warned this would take brutal training and ordered the girl not to waste a second. Mercia agreed and beckoned him to start. Mercy roared she'd become the greatest magician. He'd see it later. She swore she'd master creating a three-dimensional dome, her power stretching to infinity, and they'd vanquish every enemy while helping each other grow in strength and truth. Razel felt a spark for her attitude and blurted, "That's great." She asked if she could pose one more question. He shot back, surprised, "About what?" And Mercia dropped the bomb. She has a younger sister who's every bit as strong as she is. Mysterious sickness struck Mercia not long ago, leaving her fevered and frail. If she must leave her kingdom to journey with some guy to another world, she wants her sister crowned the next Princess of Darkness. Her sword arm is spent, but her mastery of ruling is absolute. The girl begged that maybe in his world they'd uncover an antidote to heal her sister and restore her old strength, and Razel winced. he knew he was no healer, and the mysterious disease gnawed at his mind. He declared he'd help Mercy, vowing to move heaven and earth to find an antidote for her. The princess lit up and cried out, "Really?" then thanked him politely. She shot off, snapping at the man while he'd gotten to his feet, and pushed they race back to the castle. She had to tell her sister right away. Razel agreed and begged her to skip hard liquor this time like last time, and she, flustered, mumbled that she didn't drink at all. By then, night had already swallowed the world outside, and a huge moon hung low above the horizon. She sat on the couch, lost in a book, when a glowing portal ripped open in the room before her. She gasped, shock ripping through her. Fear seized her as the space warped and she braced, convinced they meant to attack. Then Mercia and Razel burst into view before her. The guy apologized for taking so long, and she shouted to her younger sister, joy and relief pouring from her. Mercia crumpled to the floor and begged the girl's forgiveness for the scare. The little sister snapped that the girl shouldn't jump to conclusions. She just hadn't recognized her sister's magic. The girl demanded to know who the man was, and Mercia smiled, sure the reveal would leave her stunned. The Princess of Darkness named him Razel, a warrior from another world, one of the strongest. She said he annihilated and nullified her magic in seconds and even tore through her barrier. The girl warned one of his spells could catch her off guard, so yeah, he's an extraordinary magician and warrior. Razel jabbed at her with a blunt question. Did she really think she was exaggerating? Mercia squirmed and stammered, just a little bit, and the girl spun to the guy, exhaled in surprised amusement, and said, "You're one of a kind." Mercia clutched her sister's hands and begged, saying she'd brought him here desperate for him to cure her. The girl gaped, stunned by the reason the young man had come. The princess sealed her words with a steady gaze, urged the girl not to worry, promised everything would be fine, vowed they'd keep fighting with a smile on her face even if he failed, and begged her to give him a chance to heal her. The princess's younger sister stammered that if a girl trusts a guy, she certainly wouldn't mind. Razel grinned, watching the sisters' trust lock into an unbreakable bond. Mercia called his name, beckoning him over, and he answered at once, swearing he wouldn't waste a second. He slid to one knee before the girl and greeted her, declaring he was delighted to meet her, and reassuring her she shouldn't be nervous because he wouldn't hurt her. She thanked him, swore she trusted him completely, and the princess warned him to be careful with her sister. She's far more receptive than she is. Razel nodded, saying he understood. Mercia bristled at how sharp he was, and the girl pressed him about what illness was plaguing her sister, eyes wide as she burst out. Was it a magical impulse? Razel warned that the blistering surge of magic was too much for her tiny body to bear. He snapped that this torrent is why her power and health keep collapsing. The girl drank in his words with ruthless focus and blurted, "Is this a serious illness?" He reassured her not to worry. There's an antidote that can quickly focus her flow, and once it takes hold her strength will snap back to normal. It was made to suppress excess energy and heal the body, but she'll have to wait a few days for it to work. He warned her that once the pill sank into her system, its effect would last a lifetime. Mercia gaped, amazed. She asked if it was true. He pressed a capsule into her palm and told her to drink it. She nodded and agreed. She locked eyes with the girl, excitement spilling out as she called to her, and Mercy met her with a warm, caring smile, assuring everyone it was fine because they trusted the guy. After that, the princess's younger sister gave a sharp nod, popped the medicine into her mouth, and gulped it down. The girl let out a calm, steady exhale. Mercia snapped, "Has the medicine started to work?" And the princess's sister answered flatly, "Nothing's changed." Mercy erupted, shrieking that it wasn't working and demanding to know if the pill was expired, while he shoved his fingers in his ears and kept insisting it wouldn't take effect for a couple of days. He snapped he'd already warned it would take several days for the drug to fully work. The guy said he'd have to wait a bit. The girl blinked, confused, and insisted everything was fine. Then Razel pressed a fingertip to the stone on her forehead and ordered they give the medicine for exactly a week, and she agreed. Mercia gaped at the princess's hands and cried, "What is that?" The princess breathed that her power had finally calmed and she could feel it. Mercia whooped that it was amazing, and the girl nodded, beaming in agreement. Mercia crushed her little sister to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she vowed, "You'll be cured for sure." The girl glowed with agreement, and Razel watched with a soft smile, convinced they'd solved this problem too. She stared at her hands like they held the answer, hesitated for a heartbeat, then steeled herself and declared they could start. Mercia, nerves jangling, only agreed with his sister, while Razel watched in silence. She channeled her magic into the vase until it crumbled into its components. She whooped, everything worked. And she could, and Mercia gaped, stunned that her little sister had split the vase's alloy into different minerals. Razel's grin flared as she declared even the most difficult spells would fall effortlessly to her now. She beamed and declared, "This is wonderful, now I can handle simple magic." Mercia crumpled into tears, sobbing that it was truly wonderful. her little sister could cure that terrible illness, so the girl wiped the princess's cheeks, confirmed it, and begged her sister to calm down a little. Rysel warned the mushy mass of magic that spawned. She shills disease, reacts unlike anything else. Use this medicine and you'll earn gratitude from people and even magical forces. And Mercia locked eyes with him and snapped. What could suddenly happen? He flashed a grin and said he'd eaten, then rephrased it. This medicine must reach every last soldier to turbocharge the army's combat power. Confusion ripped across Mercy's face. She stared at him, eyes wide, and asked if they could mass-produce this medicine. The guy confessed that when the drug first launched, they handed it out to children in poor countries. The maker overproduced that initial batch, and now it's everywhere, the girl asked. So it was just them dumping surplus stock. The princess cracked a daring grin and declared that, devastation or not, something could always be put to use. Rysel returned her smile, met her eyes, and said that this suited her best. Mercier burst out joyfully that they had to distribute the people at once. She'd be there any moment. Then Rezel and Shishil were left alone, and the girl asked if he wanted to move closer to his sister. He hesitated and drew a deep breath, but she cut him off, snapping that it was very difficult. He shot his head up, eyes wide with surprise. She declared her sister the country's most powerful figure, trusted by everyone, and the girl admitted that's exactly where she couldn't match Mercia. Rysel bristled to reply, but the woman snapped that that's just how it was. Suddenly he froze in shock. The girl smiled broadly and swore that despite this, if he truly needed a sister and Mercia wanted it, she'd stop at nothing. She flashed a wide, fierce smile and vowed she'd do absolutely everything for her sister. Rysel fixed his gaze, smiled gently, and said he relied on her for this. He spun to Shishil and fired the question, "Do you have any political experience?" She blinked, laughed awkwardly then, cheeks burning, confessed she was mortified to have none. Rysel took a decisive sip of tea and declared she'd use it. He slid the papers across and said that whenever she wanted to learn, they'd channel professionals' knowledge to forge her into an expert, the so-called educational simulator. Conversation died into an unbearable silence as the guys stared at each other, tongues frozen. Then Mercier burst into the room, grinning, and declared she'd returned and had distributed everything correctly. Shashia shot a look at her sister and, still awkward, forced out a greeting to Mercia. The Princess of Darkness faltered and asked, voice tight, if anything had happened while she was away. Rysel clamped a hand on her shoulder, realizing she'd already returned. Her face drained of color as he sank onto the couch and announced he had to extract some of her memory. She blinked, confused, then nodded before her brain could protest. She eased into her seat, unnervingly calm with her eyes locked on Rysel as she waited to see his move. Then realization slammed into her, and she barked, loud and sharp. What did he mean, and what exactly was he going to extract from her memory? Rysel vowed to steady herself and stop crashing into unconsciousness. This educational simulator will record every scrap of her hands-on experience. She declared it was pure magic, something that mines her memories to forge educational materials, so Mercia shot a skeptical look and asked if that was really true. Rysel whipped out a handful of strange trinkets and grinned. You were right, as the girl slid one into her hair, murmured she'd managed it up to this point, but now had no idea what was really happening, and Rysel asked, are you ready to experience the difference between the worlds? Mercia snapped that everything was fine, she could handle it. Then Rysel smiled and told the girl her preparation was rock solid. He pressed his hand to the object and snapped, then let's start. A notification blinked, magic memory crystals added to his equipment, and the girl narrowed her eyes and concentrated. When she heard she could have everything, a jagged shard ripped into her mind, and Shashil froze, eyes locked on her sister. A sharp chime split the air. The Earth and Demon Control Simulator had finished installing. The girl snatched the object from her hair and asked if that was all, and Rysel confirmed he was done, urging her to try it once. Confusion flickered across Shashil's face, but she forced a nod and said she understood. Rysel snapped for her to click the red magic stone in the center, and the instant she did, her image burst onto the screen, leaving the girl gasping. The system barked that they had to report how the situation was holding up and spare it a thought, and when they spotted the mention of the famine 2 years ago, they knew they had to pick a 3 on Training Street. Surprise crackled across Shashil's face. She admitted she couldn't predict any improvement, then tried switching to number 2 mode while Mercia watched in silence. The system confirmed she was right, and joy exploded inside her. She was thrilled she could do it, and shouted that choosing 2 would work well. Mercia crowed, chest thrust forward, declaring she had carried out the regime. Shashil glowed with admiration, calling it amazing and exactly what she'd expected from her sister. Pride swelled in Mercia. Rysel charged over and declared the stimulant brilliant. She burst out agreeing, cheering that he was helping wonderfully. Then the girl met the princess's eyes and vowed she'd try, starting now and from here on. Mercia ruffled the girl's hair and murmured that she was counting on her. Happiness lit both their faces. The next day the guys assembled, and Razel vowed the second phase of her training would start now so she could eclipse the daredevil she'd met. When he asked if she was in good shape, she shot back that she was in perfect form and was counting on him. She declared her personal room would become the training ground, and he agreed on the spot. He snapped that this time she had to activate the device and unleash its magic. She asked what it was, eyes locking on the statuette on the table. Razel warned that this device sucks magic out of the air until only a faint trace remains, forcing magic to leak from living bodies and crumble away until the ambient magical concentration locks into a flat, constant level. Mercia asked if it would affect her body. He warned that if she left it as it was, her magic would run dry and she'd die, and amazement seized the girl. Razel laughed, scoffing that it hardly ever comes to this, and told him not to worry, then leaned in and snapped, "What are you going to do with the device?" He announced he wanted to trap the higher magic inside his body and wield it with nothing but human power. She gasped. He warned he can't latch onto the wild, tangled magic once he leaves the mana field. Light magic obeys only focused consciousness, so he told her to try sparking a long-burning candle. She stammered, "I understand," voice trembling, fingers fidgeting and eyes skittering, nerves plastered across her face. Mercia bounded up to the candle, grinning that she was free to do it and urging the guy to watch, when the flame snuffed out instantly, and she stared at it in sheer disbelief. The Princess of Darkness grew deadly serious, forced a smile, and declared that being a demon should make this easy. Razel stared at her, but the candle refused to light. The guy smiled at her failure again, and rage boiled in her veins. Mercy glared at the candle, screaming for it to catch fire faster. A tiny spark danced on the wick, and she whooped with pure delight. The light snapped off instantly, and the girl seethed, pursing her lips into a tight, angry pout. Mercier's shout cracked with sorrow. "What is this all about?" The girl gasped. "Did I use up all my power while casting?" She wailed that she wasn't cut out for this job, and Razel smiled at the princess and asked if she was already giving up. She heaved herself upright, tears streaking her face. Silent at first, she then vowed with iron resolve that she wouldn't stop trying until she succeeded. Razel closed his eyes, a sly smile on his lips, and declared it had unfolded exactly as he'd expected. Mercia flung her hands skyward and shouted she'd do it. A knock split the air. Razel yanked the door open and found Shishel standing there. "Who brought tea?" Someone blurted, and the guy snapped at the girl to be quiet. Shashel snapped her head into the room, tracked the man's pointing finger, and found her sister utterly consumed by training. Mercia clutched her head as a raw scream tore from her throat, and Razel and Shishel grinned at the sight. The princess's younger sister quickly thrust the tea tray into the guy's hands, leaving him blinking in confusion as she slipped into the room herself. Devastated by the failure, Mercia suddenly caught sight of her little sister standing right in front of her, meeting her gaze with a warm, steady smile. Each sister plunged into her own training, and Razel strode in balancing a tray with the tea the girl had left for him. Hours crawled past after that moment, then without warning the candle in the princess's hand erupted into flame. Delight and stunned disbelief flared inside Mercia as he stared at her, and Shishel and Razel froze, eyes wide with the same shock. The princess whooped, "I did it," and launched herself into her little sister's arms. Razel studied her thoughtfully and said it wasn't bad for the first time. The magic hadn't leaked and the fire hadn't gone out, and Mercy exploded, shouting the vow she'd sworn, "I will not give up." The princess collapsed onto the table inside, gasping that she was exhausted. Razel promised that since the girl could, they'd slowly ramp up the spell's difficulty. The guy said if she wanted to use attacking magic, she could bring it up anytime. Soon the girl will bolt into the competition, arena using movement magic. Mercia shot back that her first goal was to master unconsciousness magic. Shashil whooped that she'd definitely be the one swept along next time. Mercia declared the girl had truly grown stronger. Time had passed, and the guys stormed back into the competition arena to find the girl locked in fierce training. Mercy folded her arms and drew a seething ball of energy between them, letting it swell into a massive orb while Razel watched. He locked his gaze on the crackling bundle of energy and told the girl, "That'll do." Mercia unleashed the gathered energy and it dissolved in a heartbeat. She beamed and declared it brilliant, and the girl praised her, saying she'd done a great job and was sure the appearance and disappearance were flawless. Razel declared the girl was doing great. She climbed to this level in under a month and decided they could shut the device down now. Mercier shot a look at the guy and asked if they should still give a magic exam since the objective had been met. Razel spun to the princess with a grin, said he'd been thinking about it, and launched into a crisp rundown of what her current training would be, the intrigued girl hanging on every word. Right then a shimmering barrier burst from the guy's feet. a solid protective wall shot up to shield Rizal. He locked eyes with the girl and intoned the words that tore three-dimensional magical barriers into being. Mercia's eyes snapped wide in shock. She echoed, "Their three-dimensional magical barriers." Rizal leaned in and told the princess their foundation sat on the surface and was multi-layered. The girl asked if they were protective magical barriers, and she was right. Stacked two-dimensional magic sheets and they snapped together into a three-dimensional shield. He snarled that real three-dimensional magic barriers have to snap into shape instantly. Piecing them together wastes time because the faintest breeze tears them apart. He pinned the girl with a defiant stare, daring her to handle it. Mercia flashed that same smile, erasing every scrap of doubt. The girl swore she could do it, chanting that certainty like a war cry in her head as Mercia locked her focus and wove a shimmering barrier into being. Fragments whirled and slammed into place to build a towering wall. Rizal gaped at the girl's laser focus and flawless precision. A few heartbeats later, Mercia burst out, joyfully blurting the few words she could. Rizal grinned, "Not bad for a start," and the girl beamed, "Exactly, I'm the Princess of Darkness." In that instant, he spun to the princess and asked her to test the strength of her barrier. She froze, wide-eyed with shock. A thunderous explosion ripped out from behind the wall next to her, making her scream, and when the smoke cleared, Mercia stared in disbelief and asked, "Did I really protect her?" Mercia pressed her hand to the barrier and declared not a single scratch marked it. Rizal snapped that multi-layered magic barriers sit a far higher level than flat, two-dimensional ones. The guy leaned in and asked the girl, "Can you feel this horror?" The princess exclaimed the magical barrier was gorgeous. Burning with a fierce conviction, she'd forged its strength herself. Rise shot back that they were aiming for true three-dimensional magic barriers, so they vowed to stack more layers. Mercia flashed an enthusiastic smile and exclaimed it was great. "Let's do it then." She grinned and cried out to Rizal to look. The powerful magical barrier had erupted into being. He nodded and praised her, saying her barrier could easily shrug off any attack. Mercia collapsed to the floor, gasping, "I did it." The girl beamed, thrilled by how awesome it looked. Mercia collapsed to the floor and every breath a battle, forced out the words that demanded fierce concentration, while Rizal extended his hand to the girl and praised her for a job well done. He locked eyes with her and declared that starting tomorrow they'd dive headfirst into studying three-dimensional magic cubes and honing magic manipulation with her. Then he urged the princess to rest a little for now, and the girl stood up inside. She snapped that rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. There was no time to chill. The girl insisted she had to learn the basics of magic immediately. Rizal understood and said that was to be expected from a girl. Rizal grinned and warned Mercy to remember he'd be ruthlessly strict afterward. The princess shot back that she understood everything and urged him to hurry. Time slipped by as Rizal strode up to the girl and revealed Mercia had mentioned a special place where she wanted to continue training. He asked if this was it, and the girl smiled, confirming it was here. The Princess of Darkness grinned, swept her gaze over the fields, and announced it was a food warehouse beside the Demon Kingdom, nestled in sprawling plantations. What a breathtaking landscape. Keeping this vast territory that supplies the kingdom with food is brutal. Rain rarely falls, so once or twice a year high-ranking demons wring rain from the skies and pour it onto the plantations to keep the fields and crops alive. Rizal blurted how much rain this territory needed, shock cracking his voice, and suddenly he understood why the girl had chosen these lands for training. He closed his eyes, a smile flickering as he declared Mercia hadn't brought him here for that alone, then asked if it was true and if she had anything more to say. Mercia decided to deploy a multi-layered magic barrier to summon rain and irrigate the fields herself. The man gaped, scrambling to confirm that the rain came from the barrier and whether she'd invented the method. She spoke honestly, but it was her first real trial and doubt gnawed at her. Rizal's stomach dropped. He realized the girl was counting on him to cover her. Mercy burst out that she was just terrified something would go wrong, that instead of rain she'd trigger an explosion and drag the kingdom into peril. Mercia burned with embarrassment, and Rizal watched, awestruck that she'd pushed herself through brutal training to forge a magic barrier, admiring her all the more because the princess was doing it to protect her people. Rizal urged Mercia to first craft a simple magic barrier, then tackle summoning the rain. Mercia beamed and eagerly agreed with him. The princess started conjuring a shimmering barrier. Rizal dove into every detail with laser focus and said he believes this formula, one that boosts crop yields, jumpstarts growth, and stabilizes nutritional value, can summon rainfall. He urged Mercia to draw a plain circle first, then feed her formula into it inch by inch. He vowed he'd shout the moment anything went wrong and they'd cut the training short. Mercia agreed in a heartbeat. Mercia forced a steady breath, wiped the chaos from her mind, and drove her attention inward, telling herself, sharp and silent, that she had to focus. Rings of crackling energy whipped around the girl as Razel stared at the princess, certain she could raise a barrier and bend magic to her will. He was sure of it. Razel swallowed hard and called crafting a magic circle a terrifying gift. He told the girl it had turned out well. The guy urged them to channel magic through it, and Mercia snapped, "I understand." The Princess of Darkness coaxed her power awake, the ring of shadow swelling and ballooning outward until it became a colossal circle. At that moment, a few fat drops slapped the ground, the sky burst into rain, and ordinary residents snapped their heads up. The crowd erupted, hailing the Princess of Darkness' blessed reign. They spotted an enormous magic circle this year and thundered their thanks at her, while the girl smiled and said she could. Her eyes snapped to something in that instant. Mercia spun to the guy and demanded to know what happened. Razel flashed a smile and proclaimed it perfect. The man announced this year's harvest would be bigger than usual, and the girl crumpled to the floor inside. Tears brimmed in the eyes of the Princess of Darkness as the girl murmured, "It was good." Razel convinced herself she never shed a tear, not even through the brutal grind of training. Mercy erupted, saying they'd never again have to depend on the human race. Shame burned in her as she pictured herself crying in front of a man. The guy cried out in surprise. Razel blinked, voice tight with confusion. So there really was plagiarism. Even with food stacked around them, he demanded, "When did the deliveries end?" Mercia shot back in disbelief. "We had to copy them just to eat." Razel's shoulders dropped in relief. Being even a hair late would have made things far worse. He replied, "I understand." The girl proclaimed, "This year the Lord is on our side." Mercia lifted her chin and proclaimed the people would no longer starve, fixing a serene gaze on the sky, while the man beside her declared the harvest would be bountiful. The princess flashed a smug grin and declared she'd love to stare down the faces of the merchants who export humans, and Raisel, baffled, agreed. A long time had passed. In the royal capital, the Lilily were minding their own business when someone let out a questioning, rage-tinged sigh, clutching a paper in his hands. The king, eyes burning, roared, "What kind of pathetic sales are these?" He was talking about a 95% plunge in crop exports. The second man, terrified, stammered, "What is that?" While another man slammed a paper at his feet, shouting that it was nonsense. The king erupted, bellowing, "What's going on?" And the second man cowered, trembling and rooted to the spot. He said the other day that when merchants thinned out, he marched straight to the demon diplomat and made a direct request, saying he'd been told the demon's food self-sufficiency had passed 100%, so from now on there was no need to import the human race. The king exhaled, colder than before, and the employee, fearing the same grim mood would persist, recalled an official once executed for insulting the king and realized he was in serious danger. The king snarled that the demon's arrogance knew no bounds, spun to Regis and demanded if the three summoned heroes were armed. Regis snapped they stood ready, and the king barked for him to command them to storm the demon lord's castle. Regis stared at the king, eyes wide and grasping for words, as the king barked an order to kill the demon lord, and to write into the contract that the demon tribe must forever buy the exact same harvest as last year. Regis stepped forward, bowed low, and warned the king, "As you know, the summoned heroes can't defeat the demon lord in their current state," and the king's face broke into a pleased smile as he said he understood perfectly. The king's memory snapped to Article 7, Paragraph 3. It clearly forbids demon tribes from killing summoned heroes. Regis flinched, voice tight as he admitted it was the right thing to do. The king thundered that the demon tribe had shattered the treaty and slaughtered the summoned heroes, warning it would ignite an all-out war between humans and demons. Regis shot back that any summoned heroes who died can no longer be used for synthesis. The man locked eyes with the servant and barked that the demons were up to no good, ordering them to destroy the demons first. He scoffed at losing one or two of the summoned heroes, and Regis bowed, apologizing. The king scowled and flicked his hand, declaring that since they understood they could leave, Regis bowed and begged forgiveness, and the employee apologized, letting out a relieved exhale. He leaned in, devouring the words on the scroll beside him, as it sneered that demons were nothing but fools. He couldn't figure out their tactics, but he swore he'd make them learn the hard way that you never cross the human race. He strode down the corridor when a voice sliced the air. Someone was talking about an attack on the king's castle. He drew closer and blurted, "Is this the right room?" He could have sworn he'd just caught a whisper about the demon lord's castle, then leaned against the door, thinking eavesdropping wasn't his forte. He heard orders to summon the heroes, butcher them, and hurl them into synthesis to spark an all-out war between humans and the demon tribe. When the king's voice cut through, cold dread seized him. Calls to kill the heroes, to synthesize them, to unleash total war meant they were being used. He stalked down the corridor, scrubbing the truth from his mind with cold, practiced denial, telling himself that if he'd wanted to kill them, he would have done it long ago. Banza skidded to a halt, breath snagging as a chilling thought sliced through him. Did the king actually want them dead? He snapped the torrent of thoughts shut. A thin smile flickered across his face, and he decided he was overthinking it. Wind howled across the vast desert as Mercy spat once more. There really is nothing in this wilderness. The Princess of Darkness hissed at Gracel. Did he really want to stage a fight here? Gracel snapped that they'd made massive strides in the last 6 months. The usual arena was already bursting at the seams, and this place had no settlements or buildings. Razel flashed a smile at the girl and asked if it was time to unleash her full strength. Mercia hesitated a beat and replied that she understood. He dared the princess to stage a no-rules fight, and Mercia leaned in, eyes blazing. This time we go all out. Light flared beneath her feet, a legion of weapons assembled on her back, and she thrust a magic spear in a blur, driving the attack straight at him. Spears screamed toward Razel, crackling with magic. Ordinary defenses couldn't touch them, so he hardened into an iron shell that swallowed the shafts and shielded him. The Princess of Darkness smirked and taunted that if the guy acted like that he'd have to receive it. Then she lunged again, and Razel, calling it self-inflicted pain, readied a magnetic counter. The girl's attack slammed into the guy, then ricocheted right back into her. Mercia gasped, "What is that?" Panic clawed at her throat as she shouted, "This can't be." She shoved Mercy in displeasure aside, snapped sideways to dodge, hissed a curse under her breath, and exhaled as the attack whistled past. Razel flashed a grin and shot out, "Good idea." He felt a fire ignite. This was the moment to strike back. A dark fog slammed around Mercia, jolting her into alarm as she clapped a hand over her face and assumed it was a neurotoxic mist. She coughed once, the guy nodded, convinced everything was exactly as she said, and Razel realized she could channel the same antidote magic he wielded. The Princess of Darkness smiled as she conjured a crackling orb of energy between her palms, and Razel's jaw dropped when he realized it was far more than an antidote. Mercia hurled a furious barrage at the man, screaming for him to disappear, and Razel was instantly engulfed by the girl's crushing strength. The Princess of Darkness gaped at the guy and demanded, "What is that?" Razel smirked and asked if this was really all the girl had, then he noticed not a single scratch marred it. Completely misunderstanding the situation, Mercia demanded to know how it happened, bewilderment crackling in her voice as she turned to the guy and snapped, "Did you have any protective spells on you?" Razel flashed a grin and said she'd check his magic circle. Mercy bristled in disgust, then a bolt of realization slammed into her, and she screamed. She screamed that the spell had lost its lock on the target and cried foul. Razel gave an awkward grin and said the magic just rewrites its mark, and the man laughed that it was useless in a fight because anyone could suddenly become the target. Mercia clutched her head as indignation boiled over and screamed that rushing into such a huge move had been a mistake. Razel snapped, "You can't forge a magic circle against the hero," and that declaration struck true, working instantly as the girl's panic eased a little into a wary calm. Razel closed the gap and hissed that by waiting for a quick cast opening while secretly weaving slow, backstage magic, he would doom himself. Tactically, it was almost perfect. He flashed a grin and declared that if she stayed careful enough she'd win, praised Mercia for doing well this time, and the girl beamed and agreed. The Princess of Darkness flashed a wicked grin, vowed she'd give it her all, then slammed her fist into his with a thunderous crack. Mercia grabbed a snack, spun to the guy and blurted that she actually liked the workout. He froze, stunned, asked if she really meant it, and she answered with a firm nod. Mercia lit up about how trying new things, especially protective magic, fuels her. Razel beamed that he was pleased to hear it. The guy fretted she might burn out when she reached her goal, and Mercia blinked, saying she hadn't known he was worried. The Princess of Darkness beamed and vowed she'd be Razel's friend, swearing she was a man of her word, and the guy agreed, convinced his former comrades were different. Razel bit in and grinned, "This sandwich is amazing," the girl chimed. "Jack and I made it." A guy recoiled, "Could a demon really cook?" Mercia said, "He's one of the castle's best," and Razel nodded, realizing appearances deceive. Mercia sagged into a weary stretch, and Razel barked, "That's it, we're going home now." A monstrous shadow slammed over the guy and the girl, yanking their gazes skyward as they stared up, bewildered. A gaping maw and burning eyes loomed over them as the dragon thundered, "Are you seriously waking me?" The dark princess slammed her gaze onto the beast and shrieked, "That's a dragon." Razel snapped, incredulous, "Do you even know what dragons are like?" Mercia, eyes flashing, demanded, "Are you a fool?" He snapped back that of course he wasn't. Mercia blurted she'd never even seen him in the flesh. He shifted awkwardly and admitted that's how it turned out. Mercia declared the dragon matched the legendary beasts. He leaned forward and asked her about those legends. The princess's voice dropped to a hush as she revealed that about 10,000 years ago, the civilization that lived here was raised by a dragon. She proclaimed the lucky few who survived that dragon's storm-forged peace and still bear his bloodline to this day, warning it only holds so long as they never rouse the dragons from their slumber. Mercia's voice ripped through the silence as she named that beast the sleeping dragon of antiquity. The Princess of Darkness locked eyes with the dragon and warned, voice cold, that they'd awaken something terrible. Exile exhaled afterward, a slow, thoughtful sigh. He replied dead serious, calling it a bad thing and insisting he didn't want to be woken. She froze, stunned by his response. Exile practically whooped, "What can hit the dragon with it?" again to make it fall asleep. Mercy scoffed, "Is that guy stupid? Maybe they're not joking," and a dragon's menacing growl ripped through the air, cutting them off. With a grudging growl, the dragon demanded to know what the couple were whispering, sneered, "You little demons, even daring to look at it is an insult to me." Unaware of what he'd done, he bellowed that they'd regret their influence. The dragon hunched and sucked in raw power, priming a devastating strike. Exile's warning snapped into Mercia's head, and she slammed the absorption barrier up just as the dragon lunged at them. When the smoke cleared, the Princess of Darkness cried out in astonishment. She couldn't believe it was actually working. The dragon recoiled, stunned by what had just happened. Exile flashed a smile and declared the girl had already surpassed the dragon's strength. Mercia stared at her hands in shock and whispered, "Was that me?" Exile roared he was certain Mercia could fell that dragon in an instant. The girl echoed, daring everyone that she could kill a sleeping dragon with her bare hands. The dragon sneered they'd only prevented the attack by a ridiculous accident. Article 10, Paragraph 3 of the Pact of Man and the Beast thundered that if a sleeping dragon stirred, humanity's heroes must hunt it down and destroy it. And Paragraph 4 coldly decreed that once that happened the demon tribe would be betrayed to the humans, no different than any other time. The princess threw her head back and laughed with a cruel, razor-sharp grin, snarling that if they defeated him that terrible contract would finally be annulled. She vowed to take his body with her, cackled, and declared she already looks like a demon lord. He grinned, met the girl's gaze, then urged Mercier to press on. This won't make her a hero yet, but it's her unforgettable first battle, and pride burned in him. She grinned and declared her first fight would be against a real dragon, certain no one would ever believe her, while the dragon seethed at their arrogance and sneered that they were just small pawns. The monster shot upright and bellowed it would burn them all to the ground. Mercy grinned and declared she would end this dragon, all for the sake of the future of demons. She flung her arms wide and beamed. Spikes erupted around her as she locked icy eyes on the monster. Then she summoned a magic spear. The dragon didn't stop. He packed a massive furnace of flame into his maw to incinerate the guys, then spat one sharp line. They'd heaped every ounce of his fury onto themselves. The next moment he unleashed every ounce of power on the killers closing in. Mercia matched him, driving her attack straight at the dragon. A cataclysmic explosion tore through the area, blotting out all visibility. When the smoke and dust finally cleared, the dragon's legs came into view. Then, in the next heartbeat, he crumpled to the ground, every ounce of strength gone. She gaped at the monster's body, spun her gaze across the scene in stunned disbelief, and gasped, "Is it really over? Did I win?" Exile let out a nervous laugh. Stunned, Mercy's skills had skyrocketed past anything he'd imagined, and the dragon was pitifully weak. Mercia strode up to the monster's body and barked they had to finish her off before she jolted back to life, and Razor stared at the girl, a grin tugging at his mouth. He liked her guts. He closed in, pinned Mercia with a hard look, and asked what she planned to do with the dragon's body. She shot back, voice thundering, that they'd use her as a crucial bargaining chip in any negotiations with others. Mercia lowered into a tight crouch and scrutinized the dragon's corpse, mind racing, then asked, "Will this be enough to convince them we killed the dragon?" She spun to Exile and demanded his take on using the dragon's material to craft magic tools, insisting the remains of a dragon that had lived tens of thousands of years mustn't go wasted, and asking if he agreed. Exile fell quiet, turning her words over in his mind. A jagged gasp ripped out of him as memory slammed back. He knew it was true. Mercy spun, pinned him with a stare and demanded what happened, and he just grinned and when asked if he had any idea, said everything was right. Mercia's face lit up. She zeroed in on the guy and, breathless with excitement, demanded, "What is it? Tell me everything now." Exile flashed a warm smile and told her not to rush. He then admitted he'd need her help, vowed to tell her everything, and plunged straight into his short story. After a while, darkness draped the land, the moon hung high, and the Demon King's castle erupted into a wild, thunderous uproar. She gaped at the object and blurted, "Is this really a gift?" The girl called it wonderful but was baffled by their sudden generosity, and Mercier beamed, declaring she must accept the gift first and then speak. Exile let out an awkward sigh and backed the idea. Then in a heartbeat a weapon materialized, hovering pristine as she stared in awe and blurted, "What is that?" Rizal said it was a magic sword forged from the sleeping dragon's own materials. He said when she channels her magic into the sword, it scorches a preserved magic circle into the blade and unleashes its power, and since that circle was forged with mercy magic, only blood relatives can wield it. The sword was one of a kind and meant for her alone. She leaped to her feet, shouting she couldn't accept something so precious and admitting she couldn't bear that power by herself. Mercia sucked in a steady breath and hurled her sister's name into the air, her face carved from stone as she addressed the younger girl. She smiled warmly at her sister and warned that even if she defeated the current heroes, there was no guarantee a second or third wouldn't rise afterward. She shields pinned her sister with a silent stare. After a heartbeat, she weighed it and asked, "Are you really going to take down other heroes instead of Mercia?" In that instant, doubt gnawed at her. She realized she'd have to fight whenever Mercia wasn't around. Clutching her weapon like a lifeline, she squared her jaw and stared ahead, knowing the choices fell to her. She said she understood, and if that's true, she'll be deeply grateful to them. She beamed and admitted she couldn't wield it. The girl vowed to seal the sword in the magic vault, and Rizal flashed a rueful grin. This time the dragon hadn't fallen to him. Shock hit Shashil and she demanded, "What does that mean?" In a heartbeat, everything clicked. She turned to her sister and asked, "Is that what I think?" Mercy's proud smile widened as she confirmed, "Exactly," and admitted she had slain the sleeping dragon herself. Shashil gasped in awe, beaming that it was simply wonderful as pride swelled in him. Mercy dropped her gaze and said, "Exactly like that." Rizal, at the peak of glory, murmured that the princess had been terrified from the start, and the girl spun around in anger, snapping that she heard every word. She stared the men down, disbelief coiling in her voice as she demanded, "Are you saying every scrap of dragon material was used to forge this sword?" The girl held them in that stare, breath held, waiting for an answer. Mercy greenlit it, and Lee shouted that they still had some surplus left, so a huge feast was coming soon. Shashil snapped, calling the dragon meat feast outrageously lavish, but the girl grinned like she'd found treasure. Mercy shook her head and urged the boys to fetch the castle servants so everyone could join the celebration. Shashil beamed, saying the castle staff would help them cook the dragon meat. Mercy leaned in, murmuring they should leave the butchering to Risola. Rizal stayed calm, vowing he'd see to it that every bite came out perfect. After some time spent preparing, a crowd swarmed into a hall with towering ceilings, clustering into buzzing groups and chatting around a table heaped with countless dishes at the room's center. She roared they'd all be eating dragon meat, gasping she never imagined she'd live to see this day. Mercier admitted she couldn't believe it, even as the meat tasted incredible. Rizal smirked, saying active dragons usually have tough meat, but after so many years asleep their flesh softens into something tender and delicious. Mercia shot back that after finishing her training, she actually killed a dragon and now savors a brief, hard-won peace, but nothing's been decided yet because nothing's really even started. She swore she'd move heaven and earth to make this peace last forever. The girl lifted her eyes and declared the real battle would ignite any moment. "Is that the case?" she demanded. Rizal confirmed it and declared dragons couldn't match the raw, crushing power of fusion heroes. He said it dead serious. Mercier knew it. There's a disgusting goddess lurking behind every lineup of heroes, a woman who's been puppeteering people from the shadows for thousands of years, and nobody knows what she'll unleash the moment she smells defeat. Shishil locked her gaze ahead and barked that they must keep order and control themselves. Rizal closed his eyes and said, "She's absolutely right." She fixed the guys with a bright smile and declared with unwavering faith that the two of them would handle whatever comes next. Mercia smiled and vowed that once the battle ended she'd vanish from this world and renounce the peace treaty with the Shishil, warning the girl never to compromise with them. A terrible smile split her face as she declared they'd leave it to her. Every day she ran the hunt through her head, rehearsing exactly how she'd hunt the human race, and a cold dread pressed at her. What if she couldn't control her power? Rizal and Mercia's blood ran cold as Shashil reacted. The Princess of Darkness broke into a sweat and hissed, "I'm counting on you, sister." The Demon King's castle thundered with noise, a feast swelling the halls with hordes of demons, carousing and basking in wild revelry. Mercia flopped onto the sofa, a huge grin lighting her face as she declared she couldn't eat another bite after all she'd already devoured. Rizal barked a laugh, refusing to believe she could be a demon lord. Mercy rolled onto her side, claiming she'd already eaten and was full, then darted to her sister and called her hopelessly sloppy. A prickling alarm crawled up Rizal and Mercia's spines at the same instant. They froze and leaned in, straining to catch the last echoes of what had just happened. Rizal spun to the side and demanded, "Did you notice what just happened?" Mercia snapped, "That's exactly what happened." The girl said dryly, "There were 3 men at the main gate." They burst into a barrage of theories about who those men could be, and Rizal cut in. He couldn't pin down their combat power, but he was almost certain who they were. It hit him these were the heroes. The civil servant Fraud, the adventurer Real, and the mercenary Banzo stood at the gate, tension crackling off them. Fraud grinned, declaring this was the demon lord's very castle. Banza tensed, and Real smiled, saying he was a little disappointed they'd reached it so fast. The trip had lasted only a few months. Adventurer Real flexed his arms and grinned, declaring their target was the demon lord and he'd show him everything, while Banz panicked and yelled to the hero, "Wait a bit." He inhaled sharply, sure everything was collapsing, and realized his impulsive words hadn't changed a thing. Real strode out to the castle gate and bellowed at the demons, "Bring your lord here this instant." Every inch of him screamed deadly seriousness. The guards yanked their swords free and barked what was going on and who these orcs were, snarling that none of them would ever set foot in the castle. Rail flared, mortally offended at being called an orc, his hand balling into a fist as he demanded what that demon had just said. The angry Real cracked his knuckles and flexed his arms, sneering that the guard was practically begging for a beating, then barked one last time. Did the demon want to bring his master to them? The guard planted himself like a rock and refused to yield, fiercely vowing to defend this gate even if it cost him his life. She stared, concern tightening her voice as she declared the situation had to be very bad. Rizel said it was time they went outside. Mercia drew a deep breath and agreed they'd have to go out. Razel scoffed that by that logic he'd have been dead ages ago, yet he still looks exactly the same. Mercy suggested Razel should have disguised himself. The guy paused, thought it over, then admitted maybe he really should have done it. The hero dropped into a fighting stance to take down the demon as the guard thrust his weapon forward, poised for a brutal clash. Rial screamed. The guard echoed her cry, baiting the hero into lunging at him. They lunged at each other, just as their guns were about to meet. A deafening explosion ripped through the air, stunned. Both froze and the fight slammed to a halt. Rial sprang back, demanding to know what had started this, while Fraud and Banza tore toward the adventurers, breathless and jittery as they frantically asked if he was okay. A titanic cocoon of crackling magic loomed before the guard and the heroes, and the guard, wary, warned, "It's magic." In that instant the cocoon burst open, and two figures spilled out. Mercier's gaze went ice-cold and cruel as he glared at the uninvited pair and snapped, "Do you even know where you are right now?" Real's head snapped to the side, surprise flashing in his eyes as he blurted, "The Lord has appeared." The bands leaned in, voices taut, warning that a single step from the hero could easily destroy them. The knights guarding the Lord's castle dropped to their knees before Mercia, begging forgiveness. He turned to the girl and vowed they'd muster the soldiers and wipe them out at once, and Mercia waved them off, telling the knights not to worry. The Princess of Darkness fixed the uninvited guests with a cold stare and announced she wanted to speak with them too, while Vanzo doubted they'd manage a proper conversation and suggested they try to squeeze useful information from the intruders. Real snarled at the princess with displeasure. "How dare you talk to us like that?" Bonza cut him off and told him to wait. The hero, crackling with excitement, said he had an idea and asked the hero to give him a minute, leaving Real slightly taken aback. Banza snapped to Mercia and admitted they weren't from this world, apologizing for their rude behavior, while the hero told the girl she clearly held sway among the demons and leaned in to say he had one burning question for her. Bonza confessed, despair clawing at his voice, that he knew it was rude and begged the girl to hear him. Real snapped skeptically, "Is this really our plan?" And Fraud, doubtful, reluctantly agreed that the hero was a crafty schemer and they'd leave it to him for now. Mercia, displeased in lifting objects with cold telekinesis, told Razel they'd entered the castle, clashed there, and still wanted to talk. Razel's face fell as he realized how serious things were with all the summoned heroes, and Mercia apologized that he had to be the one to face them. The hero crashed into Razel and Mercia's conversation, blurted a line about the brave man in synthesis, and demanded whether those words meant anything to the demons. Razel and Mercia gaped in shock. A gloom-laced question slipped from her lips, "Do they really know these words?" And Banza's eyes popped as he shot back, "You really know them too." The Princess of Darkness pinned Razel with a cold stare and asked, "What do we do now?" Razel shrugged and left it to the girl, who nodded and said, "I understand everything." Mercy spun on her heel and strode off, declaring they were moving out and ordering everyone to start preparations. Razel nodded in agreement while Banza watched them go, wide-eyed and stunned. Real and Fraud stormed up to Hatsa, firing questions about what was happening. Real demanded why any of this was necessary, and Bonza kept repeating, "Everything's fine," his voice cracking with worry. Suddenly a colossal seal ripped into being above the gathered heroes, and their jaws dropped in stunned silence. Real whirled around, panic ripping through him as he demanded, "What's going on?" Fraud choked out he'd never seen a magic circle this massive and intricate. Real snapped, "Now is not the time for that." And Bonza just stared at them in dead silence. The heroes erupted into a storm of curses, roaring they'd been duped and spitting that the demons would never admit it, while nearby bands stared, stunned and sure the betrayal was real. The guys bellowed, eyes locked on the light swelling above them. She whipped around to the summoned heroes and barked, "Look up." The heroes gaped at the girl before them, bewilderment blazing across their faces as they froze on the spot. Mercy flashed a smile, agreed to their request, and revealed the summoned heroes were waiting in the Demon Lord's castle audience hall. She burst into view and, voice ringing with confidence, declared herself the Lord of Demons, as Razel stood obediently at her side like a silent shadow. Banz's jaw dropped. They were in the audience hall. Fraud reeled, unable to believe she had actually moved them all. Rial's voice cracked. Was that the Demon Lord? The Princess of Darkness smirked at the summoned heroes and vowed to unveil the world's truths. Ask anything, she challenged, and Bonsa snapped at the bishop, demanding to know what heroic synthesis is and why they were called. The Demon Lord snarled that the dozens of summoned heroes would be fused into one living power source, a composite hero forged as humanity's ultimate weapon and the demon race's sworn enemy. Bonzo flinched as he blurted the truth he'd been hiding. Another hero exploded, shouting they'd been duped. Real screamed for proof and demanded rock-solid evidence that the king engineered this, and Fraud stepped in, arms out, trying to calm him. Mercia perched on her throne, acknowledging his distrust and seeing his short temper, urged him to rein it in and be patient for a while. Banza stood there, baffled by the answer. Razel locked eyes with them and said, "We haven't seen each other in a long time." Real asked cautiously, "Who are you?" The man replied, "As you can see, you wouldn't recognize me in this form," and his disguise began to peel away. Razel materialized before them and demanded how the heroes felt. The man grinned and said he wanted them to see something. Banza burst out, stunned that it was the same guy. Real froze in disbelief, and Fraud snarled that he should be dead. Suspicion burned in Razel as he crafted something, and he snapped at the hero to prove it wasn't a trick. Then a tiny camera materialized in the hero's hand. Banza gaped at the image, shock cutting through him as he blurted, "Is that really the king's office?" Fraud stared, marveling at the picture's uncanny accuracy, and declared the technology brilliant. Rial, baffled, demanded, "How did that guy find out about this place?" They peered at the picture and demanded, "Who's the man standing before the king?" The hero froze. He'd never seen him in the palace, and Mercy tilted her head, smiled, and said, "That's convenient." The Demon Lord snarled that this hero was a synthetic, the very fruit of their experiments. Fraud snapped that no matter how he looked, he was still just an ordinary man, and he sneered, sure the girl might fool those two, but she'd never fool him. He jabbed at the screen and demanded, "Can you read the numbers on that video?" The heroes leaned in and asked, "What is it?" Rizel said, "It's my first measured combat value since I came to this world." Fraud recoiled, eyes wide, and demanded, "How can a hero be summoned with that kind of power? Are you saying this number is the sum of every hero ever summoned?" The Princess of Darkness sneered that they'd been summoning heroes from day one, and every single one wound up as the monster's next meal. Vanza recoiled, shouting it was impossible and demanding to know if that meant they'd never get back to their world. Fraud broke down in tears, unable to fathom never seeing his family again. The hero barked, "What do we do?" And Real spat a curse as he demanded how any of this could be possible. Mercy stared them down and shot back, voice cold. Humans, wielding superior strength and numbers, had oppressed the demons for years. That was the world's ugly truth. She erupted, unleashing years of smoldering resentment over their oppression, accusing them of what they'd done to their friends, their people, their homeland, then spat, "I will never forgive the human race." Bonds crumpled to his knees, desperation ripping through him as he begged the girl for any scrap of help. He bellowed he'd take any job, didn't care if it was a filthy chore or serving some lowly minion. He'd carry out whatever orders they gave. The Demon Lord glared at the guys and scoffed, wondering aloud what the other summoned heroes thought of her. Fraud fell silent, and the Real side bristled with displeasure. The next instant the Fraud dropped to his knees and agreed. Rail cried out to the hero in shock, and the hero hurriedly apologized, begging to be taken home at any cost. Rial ground his teeth and bowed low to the girl. Banza whirled to the Demon Lord, imploring her to pity the poor fools, then begged the girl to save them. Mercia locked eyes with the heroes, smiled broadly, and declared, "I'm giving you your first order." The Demon Lord snarled that the three summoned heroes must die. The guys shot their heads up, shock ripping through them. Word thundered through the kingdom. A band of adventurers sent into demon lands had ignited a bloody internal war that wiped the demons out, and whispers said that, given past patterns, the demons would charge them with murder. The report branded it negligence that led to a death, and the minimum penalty is 1 year behind bars. The king scanned the report, displeasure carved across his face, then coldly declared it fair. Relief flooded him when they stayed quiet instead of whining and demanding proceedings. The king boomed that handling accusations from cursed demons isn't easy, and a ring suddenly flared above his head. A sudden movement above jerked his gaze upward. He spat a curse and screamed, toppled to the floor, clutching his head as he demanded, "What happened? What fell?" And when he peered closer, shock nailed him in place. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor before the king as a man, horror carved into his face, stammered and shouted that these were corpses. He stared in horror at the gaping holes in their bellies. The king, stunned, shot out, "Why are you in my office?" And the next instant darkness clawed at him as he slipped toward unconsciousness, a living nightmare. Just hours ago, the summoned heroes stood in the demon lord's castle as the Princess of Darkness leaned forward and thundered her first decree: the heroes must die for her. The summoned heroes gaped, shock freezing their faces as the truth slammed down. The girl had duped them after all, and Banza snapped, "What does that mean?" Mercier pinned them with a hard stare and declared flat out that she was telling the truth. Razel spun to the girl, excitement bright in his voice as he asked if he could finally stop torturing him, and the girl mumbled something, thoughtful as she weighed her reply. The Princess of Darkness exploded into laughter, siding with the guy and sneering she'd already seen their summoned heroes' ridiculous faces, while Riel gasped, stunned, "What just happened?" Riel's frown slammed down as he snapped at the girl, "Are we some kind of joke to you?" Razel watched and realized she'd clearly offended him. Mercia smiled and apologized, saying she was only amused. Banza whooped to the hero, excitement fizzing in his voice. Riel shot back that the hero wasn't one of those sharp planners who does things in order, so the hero begged the girl to spell it out until even he could follow. Mercy froze, surprise widening her eyes as she stared at the hero. She leaned in and snapped, "Don't sell yourself short," then admitted she liked honest people like him. The Princess of Darkness spun to Razel, and voice sharp as a blade, asked him to explain everything to the others. He met her gaze and nodded, agreeing with her. Razel leaned in and revealed the heroes had been told he was dead, demanding how anyone thought he'd fooled his pursuers and the kings. Fraud guessed some kind of magic. Banza crowed he'd tricked them into believing his death, and Riel snapped he'd run as hard as he could. Razel dropped that he'd disguised the corpse. The heroes recoiled and snapped it didn't sound good, and Fraud barked he understood exactly what the man meant. Riel gaped baffled and demanded what it meant. Fraud snarled that it meant the guy had another body. Banza's expression went icy as he decided the guy had committed a murder. Razel barged in, insisting he hadn't killed anyone in this world, and even that he'd staged his own corpse. Mercia laughed, and when her scoff proved she didn't buy it, the man snapped that she wasn't laughing. Fraud exhaled a skeptical sigh and snapped, "You seriously mean you have another body?" Banza scoffed, calling it utter nonsense, while Riel recoiled in horror, blurted that he hated ghosts and begged for a break. Razel harnessed multifunctional stem cells and spawned a duplicate of himself, the same cloning magic Frode wielded and the force that created the Foucault boy. Cloning tech exists in their world, but is still crude and impractical, so Razel using it made perfect sense. Riel was sure dying in battle just shoved you into another body. He practically fizzed, insisting that even if it was a clone he'd still be alive, asked if that was true, and then admitted he hated the idea. Fraud snapped that it was flat-out unethical. Banza demanded to know what cloning even meant ethically. Riola froze, dread tightening at the idea of his copy standing right beside him. Razel, baffled, said their functions had been severely curtailed. In that instant, he bellowed a quick summary, and the thunder of his voice sent the others recoiling in fear. Razel barked they'd use clones this time, insisting he didn't care what the guys said and that he'd fulfill his mission. Mercia cut in awkwardly, asking if they even needed the guy's consent for something like that. Advanced cloning magic. The bodies were eerily real and the heroes stared in shock. Razel repeated the line, explaining their life support had been severed, and the man grinned, admitting he'd been using those clone corpses to stage their deaths. Fraud barked, "What are you going to do with those staged corpses? Leaving them on human territory is suicide," Banza snapped. "Dump them in some deserted spot and they'll rot into unrecognizable husks," and Razel nodded, smirking, "Don't worry, I have an effective way." Razel locked eyes with the heroes and swore he'd dispatch the body straight to the king's office. Mercia vowed to bind a sealed letter to it with her magic. Sometime later, in the king's chambers, a figure hovered over the bed, tentatively shaking his majesty awake as he knitted his brow and muttered under his breath. Regis leapt forward, practically shouting that the king had woken. The king called out to Regis, and the servant said he'd suddenly heard screams, ran to check, and saw a man surrounded by corpses. Drained, the king confirmed the corpses were there. Then his eyes snapped open, and he demanded what kind of corpses they were. Regis confirmed, voice clipped, that these were the 3 summoned heroes he'd sent to the demon lord's castle. The king said he understood, snapped that the lord had finally crossed the line, then wondered if it was already too early to return the bodies, and Regis hesitated, trying to add something about it. The servant thrust a tiny device into the king's hand, insisting the answer waited inside, and the king frowned, snapping, "What kind of device is this?" Regius announced a device, and a letter had been left beside the corpse, insisting it looked like a machine to transfer summoned heroes. The servant warned its range reached 20,000 kilometers. The king pointed out the demon king's castle lies 4,000 kilometers away, yet the king still couldn't believe such a contraption. The king spat curses at the demons for seizing a high sage, snarling that without him they couldn't have forged such a strange device. A man demanded to know from Regius what the letter said, and the servant immediately pressed it into the king's hands. The letter declared it was the season for eating food in pots, so they readied the donated summoned heroes and sent them back. The girl announced they'd taken care of the sleeping ancient dragon and demanded the contract be cancelled. The food trade was scrapped, and the hero's arrival marked a declaration of war. Rage boiled in the king as he crushed the letter he'd left, roaring that its brazen words meant the treaties must be renegotiated and snapping at Fladialka. Did she even grasp what that meant? While Regis leapt up, shouting for him to calm down because it would wreck his health. The king feared they were plotting to fabricate charges and topple the kingdom overnight. The man ground his teeth, cursing the girl and every one of her people in his head. He roared to Regius, ordering him to tell the synthetic heroes to get ready for the campaign, then snapped at his servant to send them back to the demon lord with a vow they'd crush and burn their lands. Regia shuddered, bowed low before the king, and warned that the demon's recent movements screamed of danger. He urged sending scouts first to probe them. The king glared at the servant, demanding if Regis really dared him. The man snarled, "Do you want the king to execute you?" And Regis exhaled in terror, bowing his head and promising he'd do as the king wished. Rage boiled in the king's mind as he silently cursed the demon lord, convinced he'd overstepped, and resolved to send the newly forged heroes to shove him back into his place. Laughter detonated through the night-cloaked castle. A single thought stabbed the king. It was time to end it. The Princess of Darkness cackled, taunting them as they stared, then gleefully declared the king had fallen for her tricks. A heavy, sorrowful silence fell as Fraud announced, "This is what the demon lord looks like," and Banza, bewildered, insisted she was no different from any other little girl. Razel scoffed that the king would never do what he was told, but wound his pride with an insult to his honor, and he'd flipped the script entirely. Mercia smiled, retorted she didn't think a man would fall for that so easily, then laughed. The demon lord exhaled a delighted, triumphant sigh and announced the girl had finally clicked where she should. Razel exhaled, a smile spreading, as he said the girl had finally done it. The guy vowed he'd be here any minute. Rial staggered, helplessly admitting he had no idea what to do now they'd shown him everything. Fraud cringed and mumbled he was ashamed of what he'd been doing. Banzo admitted he'd never noticed before they'd been kept in luxury. Mercier exhaled, relieved they'd grabbed the guys before they could be synthesized. Rial snapped that something about it didn't sit right, and Fraud echoed him, scoffing that synthesis was nothing next to cloning. Banza's been on edge since he heard that, and Razel spun to the guy, stunned at how unnervingly relaxed they were. A sharp knock shattered the silence. Razel turned to the others, curiosity burning. Who could it be? The man at the door declared he had brought them a teleportation grimoire, and Razel nodded, taking it. The servant bowed and announced a letter had arrived. Mercia accepted him and thanked him for his hard work, the girl smiling as she said she'd count on him for anything else. He agreed and quickly left the room. Curiosity gnawed at the Princess of Darkness. She tore the letter open, studied its lines intently, and declared she understood every word. Razel leaned in, voice snapping. "What's going on with the king? Did we get what we wanted?" The girl flashed a grin and said it was great. Mercia said a month later, in Minaris's western desert, the king ordered the synthesized Hera to ride out and pacify the demon lord for breaching Article 7.3 of the contract between humans and demons. Real's voice went hard. This was the moment the war finally began. Prad gulped. He'd never been this nervous. Banza growled that he'd never fought anyone this much stronger. The demon lord's glare pinned them as he demanded what they'd been whispering about, and Rizel shot back that he wouldn't lay a finger on them this time. Rial, Fraud, and Banza turned to the couple, questions blazing in their eyes as the information left them utterly baffled. Razel insisted only a handful would join this war, declaring humanity's goal was to unleash the synthetic hero's overwhelming might, topple the demon lord, and seize control of the demons, and the guy said the odds of a surprise attack were virtually zero. Mercia snarled she'd seize the chance, strike back at the synthetic heroes, the human race's main weapon, and smash their arrogance to pieces. The summoned heroes gaped at the girl, disbelief roaring from them as they insisted it couldn't be true and scrambled to grasp what she meant. The demon lord declared with iron confidence that she and the synthetic heroes would fight alone. In the demon lord's castle, Razel exhaled a slow, thoughtful sigh and declared that, for now, everything would remain as it was. A rumpled Bonza spotted Rizel and called out a bright good morning. the hero snapped, "What are you doing here?" And Rizal shot back that he was gearing up for a decisive battle, assuming the hero was just out for a morning walk. Banzo barked yep, warming up, then craned his neck at the weird contraption and asked if that was what the guy was training with. Rizal scoffed, "It's an image broadcasting artifact," and the man smirked that he'd planted them all over the territory, even inside the castle. The hero's jaw dropped when he learned those things were planted all across the territory, and he demanded Rizal really had that many magic stones. Banza prayed they wouldn't need a stone for everyone. Rizal admitted he didn't have enough, so Fraud stepped up and shared his because he can stash them with storage magic. Banzo's heart froze when he realized the final battle had been set yesterday, stunned that the man had churned out so many artifacts in a single day, and the hero concluded he was unmistakably more dangerous than the Princess of Darkness. The hero demanded why Ryza was even posting them, and Ryza smirked, saying he wanted everyone to witness the clash between the Princes of Darkness and the hero. Banza demanded why the guy needed it, and Rizal shot back that it was to broadcast the girl's strength so everyone would see and be too terrified to lay a finger on her, even after the princess was gone. Confusion cracked the hero's voice as he demanded why she wouldn't be there. The man assumed the Princess of Darkness was going to leave, and Rizal smirked, saying he wanted to invite her into his world. Someone needed to get what he deserved. Shock slammed into Banzo, his mind reeling at the idea that a world might exist where a man stood undefeated by Rizal, and he thought in horror that not even their summoned heroes could so much as scratch him. The hero locked eyes with the man before him, relief roaring that they'd avoided a fight, and he stepped forward to offer his help. Rizal thanked him. Minutes later, she leaned into the mic and launched into a sharp count, testing the sound. Crowds swarmed toward the noise, heads buzzing with questions, until Saren's unmistakable voice sliced through and they recognized her. Zarina addressed the assembled demons, thanked them for waiting, and the girl declared the decisive battle between the hero and the Princess of Darkness was about to begin. A demoness erupted onto the screen, daring them to behold the massive army arrayed against them today, and smiling she said she was Zarina, a guard of the Princess of Darkness, and that she would comment. Rizal swept his gaze over the assembled soldiers and sneered there were fewer than he'd expected. Mercy guessed they'd assumed demons were weak. The Princess of Darkness snarled they'd have to be put in their place this time. By then someone stepped forward, shouting the demons were showing off and could fly. He scowled and snapped only 2 of them, before exploding, insisting they'd underestimated the demons. A man in armor strode into view, tipped his helm to Mercia, and declared they'd been apart for ages. The Princess of Darkness had bloomed into a breathtaking woman. Mercy spat that compliments from someone who can't even remember her name are hollow. The girl scoffed she couldn't spot the goddess anywhere, and the guy laughed that it made sense, the goddess wouldn't come. He said neither of them would have been enough, only he alone could. The Princess of Darkness pried into Rizal's mind and demanded whether the goddess lurked nearby. Rizal hissed that she did, but wasn't in combat mode. He figured she was just watching to stave off boredom. The girl said she understood everything, which meant the goddess wouldn't lift a finger to help them. Rizal's breath caught as the goddess held back, and in a flash the scattered clues slammed into place. He suddenly blurted he'd remembered something crucial, announced he'd have to leave the girl here alone, insisted she'd cope and laughed about his own forgetfulness, while Mercy, clearly delighted, asked if he was up to something again. Mercia snorted, a smile curling on her lips as she shot back that even if she begged he'd still leave. Is that true? She snapped, just go. The Princess of Darkness leaned back, smirking that by the time the guy returned she'd already be finished here. Rizal melted into the air, faced the girl with a grin and said he'd be only glad. The hero shot a grin at the girl and called, "You're really going to fight alone? Is the entire demon race going to come to your aid by any chance? Maybe then you'll have a chance." And Mercy simply stared at him in silence. A tiny, unexpected laugh slipped from the Princess of Darkness. She then burst into loud laughter, and the hero, bewildered, demanded, "What happened?" He couldn't fathom what she found so funny. Mercy smirked, saying she could finally see the gulf in their strength, scoffing that she couldn't believe she'd ever been afraid of such a weakling. Then the girl fixed the guy with a gloomy stare and called the whole thing laughable. He spat the words with bitter fury, "I'm a weakling," then glared and demanded, "Were you talking about me?" The air around him snapped. He turned to the knight, vowed he'd handle it alone, ordered them not to climb, and the knight obeyed instantly. Dark energy slammed over the Princess of Darkness, consuming her in an instant as she sneered that the hero was a fool for falling for such a simple provocation. Mercia whipped her hand up and screamed that the hero would die today. The guy, eyes blazing with determination, hurled himself into the fray. Smirking, the hero swung his sword with lazy confidence and launched a razor wind through the air, bellowing, "I'll finish you in 10 seconds. Mercia shrugged off the hero's attack with a single effortless sweep of her shield. then threw her head back to the sky as dark clouds roiled and lightning ripped the heavens. A jagged bolt of lightning ripped into the ground beneath the man's feet. The attack blasted into the hero, and he screamed. Blood dripped to the ground as the hero locked his furious glare on the girl and spat curses. Mercy, bored, asked if he was still on his feet. The Princess of Darkness bolted, warning such a wound couldn't be healed immediately. The hero let out a ragged, painful sigh. The hero grinned and swore he could heal that wound in a heartbeat, but time ran out, so the girl stepped forward. Boom after boom ripped through the sky above him, forcing his head to snap up. Mercia snapped her fingers as the guy, grinning and trying to claim the girl was only scaring him with firecrackers, was slammed by a lightning-fast attack that hit him before he could react. Blood erupted from the hero's mouth. He clocked how fast it spilled. The girl conjured in an instant, and Mercia grinned, calling the guy a fool. The Princess of Darkness unleashed her energy at him. The hero flashed a grateful smile for letting him mend his wounds and opened his mouth to declare his next move, but his voice died. He froze as her dark aura poured over him and swallowed him whole. Mercy's power ripped into the man's body through the wound, racing like wildfire. He blurted, shaking, "What's happening to me?" And Mercy, thoughtful, said, "It must be something like that." Sure, those words would be enough. The Princess of Darkness loomed over the wounded hero and sneered, "I'm simply stronger than you. That's it." The hero staggered backward, utterly spent as the man spat, "So everything turns out like this," and the hero crumpled as his body unraveled into dust, leaving only a bare skeleton. Mercy took in the scene with a stone-cold stare and stayed silent. After a few moments she deadpanned, "It's boring." A knight from the hero's army stumbled to the man's body, disbelief ripping through him as he gasped, "This can't be." He croaked the hero's name, but no answer came. Zarina zeroed in on it and blasted the latest events into the room with a shout that exploded in blinding light. The demoness sneered, crowing that the hero got such a stupid ending. Zarina roared that victory for the Princess of Darkness was certain, and the crowd erupted into thunderous cheers for the girl. The demoness declared the broadcast over, then bellowed triumphant congratulations to the Princess of Darkness as the signal died. Mercia spun to face the man and demanded if he'd seen everything. The girl snapped she was done in a flash. Razel grinned and called it a glorious battle. The man said he'd wrapped up his business too. Mercia flashed a grin and asked Razel what he was doing there. Razel answered with a sweet, sly smile that he'd done nothing wrong, and then admitted he'd just stolen an artifact of the hero's, making Mercia sigh with surprise carved across her face. She gasped, "Is that the same artifact?" He shot back, "Yes," then grinned and exclaimed, "You can't just leave him." Mercia practically crackled with curiosity, begging to try it right then. Razel ripped off his disguise and snapped for her to wait until the audience left. Razel thrust his chin skyward and, dripping confidence, dared God with a roar, declaring God was watching, shouting he'd stolen the hero's artifact and demanding he show up now, but his scream met only silence. Razel scanned the room while the Princess of Darkness gloated that the provocation had worked. God didn't appear. Mercia spat the price in furious tones. The man shut his eyes, smiled that it was no problem, and vowed he'd soon create a situation where he'd show up. Mercy's eyes blazed as she fired. "Are you going to do it right now?" Razel turned around, flashed a grin, and said, "Yes." He declared he'd launch an experiment to synthesize himself, to forge the hero he was dead set on becoming. Mercia grinned, saying even if she begged him to stay he'd still slip away. She asked if that was true, then insisted he had to go, and the girl promised she'd be finished here by the time he returned. Razor grinned and said she'd be thrilled, and as he strode away, he was certain her skills would let her hold her own here without him. A sly grin spread across his face. With security weakened, he'd slip in and snatch the hero's synthesizer. Razel hunched over the map, fingers stabbing at the paper, as the image screamed the device had to be somewhere right here. He slipped into the shut room, raking his gaze over the shadowed corners and deciding it was empty. Razel locked onto the device at the room's center, swept the chamber and realized there were no traps, then snatched it, sure they'd underestimated him. Razel stared at the device in his hands, certain no one would come, and when nothing else happened he seethed. Bitter, he'd grabbed it with almost no struggle. Calm flooded him when he realized he'd suddenly have more free time. Then something flashed into view and stunned him, and a grin split his face as he imagined what the device would do. He skidded back to the Princess of Darkness, who loomed over the stricken hero and cocked her head, wondering if she'd already finished him. Mercia jabbed Razel with a question, "You saw everything," and said she'd finished in a blink. Razel grinned, called it an epic battle, said he'd wrapped up his own business, and when Mercia pressed about the guy he shrugged, insisting he'd done nothing wrong, he'd merely snatched one of the hero's artifacts. The Princess of Darkness gasped, "Is that the same artifact?" The guy nodded, "Yes, we can't just leave him like that." The girl squealed, "Can we try it now?" And Razel smirked, "Hold off, the audience is waiting." Rizzle spun toward the sky and shouted he knew exactly what he was seeing. He bragged he'd seized the hero's artifact and dared God to show himself right now. Mercia blurted, bewildered, "God isn't showing himself." The guy shot back that the provocation had failed, shrugged as if it meant nothing, and vowed he'd stage a scene to force God to appear. The girl lunged forward, eyes blazing. "Are you going to do it right now?" Rizel smirked and vowed he'd kick off an experiment to fuse himself with the hero. Confusion slammed into Mercia when she realized the experiment wasn't about her, but about a guy, so she cut in and spelled it out. Razel warned the artifact most likely siphons one person's magic and funnels it into another, actually boosting the total magical power, and Mercia listened, mind racing, then asked if it wouldn't be better to use it on her instead of the guy. Shock cracked across his face as he snapped at Mercy. "You didn't notice." She could only stare back, disbelief carved into every line of her face. Razel blurted that the girl's magic outmatched his. Mercy froze, disbelief burning. She couldn't accept being stronger than that guy. Razel declared the girl strong and bound to grow stronger. She must. He pressed the point, reminding her he'd said she needed a comrade to fight shoulder to shoulder, and Mercia, thoughtful, echoed that the man was her friend. He snapped that he wasn't joking now, refusing to let her be weaker than him. He couldn't afford to be so weak he'd be useless. Mercia nodded, understanding clear in her eyes. Rizel revealed the device hid another secret. The girl gasped. The guy insisted he must be tied to the goddess. Mercia gasped, "What if the goddess suddenly seizes the guy's mind?" Razel shot back that if he exploited that opening it could happen, but the guy was a master of mind control magic and vowed he'd resist. The princess seethed because even if he said he didn't agree, the guy barreled on anyway, and Rizel grinned, insisting he had to try it. Razel's curiosity flared as he admitted he'd never know if it would work until he tried it. Mercy scowled at him and snapped that he had no sense of self-preservation at all. He whooped, "Now's our shot, let's go." She thought if she'd beamed, yes, right, then he'd have died of joy. Rizel hoisted the device before him and roared they could begin. The instant he spoke, the fallen hero's body erupted, engulfed in crackling power. He clutched the device as a crackling surge of energy began to pierce him. Shock ripped through him. Mercia planted herself next to him, slamming a hand over her eyes to block the blinding light blasting from the guy. Razel slammed his eyes shut, convinced the launch would go off without a hitch and that no one was pulling his strings. The Princess of Darkness pressed, panic coiling in her voice, demanding an update. Razel steadied himself and said the magical power had shot off the scale, but he insisted everything still looked under control. He fixed her with a grin that split his face and declared their experiment a success. Mercia locked eyes on the man clutching the glowing light and erupted into a joyful shout, her mind screaming that it was impossible. Razel's gaze snagged on something, and he and the girl snapped their heads aside to find a man standing there. Razel shot, "Are you the army's commander?" The girl hissed he looked like it, but the man shook his head and said no. He gaped and demanded where the couple had gotten it. Razel and Mercia flashed smug, contented smiles. The man shrugged and admitted he'd stolen it, sneering, "You fool," at him. The commander froze. How could that be when they'd hidden the device deep in the capital? Mercia landed a hair's breadth from him, slammed a scroll into his hands, and snarled he was to carry it to the king instead of wasting breath on indignation. When he asked what it was, she spat that it was the document sealing mankind's surrender. Tears blurred his vision as the commander choked out that if he took it to the king would have him killed, or they'd torture him. Execution would be salvation. The princess asked, "Are you really that terrified of the king? I could lop off your head this instant and send it to the capital in pieces with the hero's corpse," and the man shrieked in horror that he understood everything. The man bolted, screaming. The girl shouted after him, "Don't worry, we'll reach the capital before your execution and get you out." And the commander agreed, saying they should definitely come. The soldiers spun to the commander, questions burning in their eyes. He snapped, "We're retreating," then glared at me and ordered, "Don't ask unnecessary questions." Razel asked Mercia if the man could deliver it. Mercia said she was certain he could handle it, and the girl felt the commander's stare scream they'd better save him, or his ghost would curse them for the rest of their lives. The Princess of Darkness gave a stiff, awkward wave and let out a brittle laugh, proclaiming she knew everything and declaring nothing could be done. Razel nodded in agreement, saying they needed time. Mercia fixed her gaze on the retreating army and asked if teleporting them away was worth it. Razel thrust his hand up and stared at it like it held a secret, excitement crackling in his voice as he told Mercia he wanted to test a new facet of his magic. She turned back, murmured something thoughtful, then said she understood. Razel flashed a sweet smile at the offended girl and leaned in, asking what was wrong. Was she in a bad mood? Mercia twirled a strand of hair around her finger, locked eyes with him, and snapped that it was because he was the only one who got something new, declaring she was the one who defeated the hero. He locked eyes with the Princess of Darkness, enthusiasm crackling, jabbed a finger at her and declared, "Don't worry, I've got a secret plan just for you." Mercia clapped a hand to her mouth in shock and burst out about his secret plan. Razel spun to Mercia with a wide smile and insisted they head back to the Princess of Darkness's castle first. A man shouted the exact line Shield, and the others had been waiting ages to hear, and Mercia beamed, thinking of her subjects and itching to see their shocked faces. After the conversation, the guy and the girl headed home with Mercia trotting cheerfully ahead of him, when Razel jabbed a finger to the side in surprise, and the girl snapped her head that way, just as stunned. All the maids and knights of the Princess of Darkness packed the Demon Lord's palace courtyard, neatly lined in several rows as they waited for the girl. At the front of everyone stood Shishilan Tsarina, burning with anticipation for Mercia. Spotting her assembled subjects, Mercia bolted forward with a radiant grin. Razel lingered quietly behind her, closed his eyes, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Tears streaking her face, the Princess of Darkness hurled herself at little Shashiel and crushed her returned sister into a sobbing, joyful hug, while the same joyful servants beamed behind them. Among the crowd, the Princess of Darkness realized Jack was gone, absent for some unknown reason. She spun in disbelief as a demon materialized just steps from the sisters locked in an embrace. The demon cradled a massive tray piled with steaming, fresh food, grinning broadly, while the Princess of Darkness and her little sister stared with ravenous eyes at the hot dish before them. Jack locked eyes with the girls and burst into booming laughter, the sisters' faces lighting up at the massive hunk of meat cradled on the demon's tray, while Razel watched the scene with a smile. The guy hovered just off the Princess of Darkness and her sister, eyes locked on them, when the girl swept her hand and beckoned him to come closer. After a while, the sisters slid into bed and lay together. She turned to her sister and, eyes still closed, whispered a single, questioning plea, "Mercy." She stared at her sister with fierce admiration and proclaimed she had truly defeated the hero. Mercia's eyes flickered open and she nodded calmly, lifted her hand to inspect it and said, "I did it with these hands." The Princess of Darkness's younger sister hung on Mercia's words in silence, then admitted in a trembling whisper that she was terrified, her hands still shaking, so Shishel gently laid her hand over Mercia's, freezing the Princess of Darkness in surprise. She fixed her sister with a worried stare and declared those hands had shielded their people and the whole country. The girl replied it was the hand of a ruler they could be proud of, and she added that it might be only the first step, but it's a massive one. Surprise shot across Mercia's face as she turned to her younger sister, who repeated, eyes blazing, this might only be the first step, but it was important. She swore from that moment on that, even if the Princess of Darkness vanished, she would protect this country and the entire world. Meanwhile, Razel stood outside the door, straining to catch every syllable of the two sisters' conversation. Some time later, a horde of demons waited for something, and at that moment, the Princess of Darkness stood before a vast staircase, her eyes locked on it. The Princess of Darkness surged forward, every step quick and confident as she swept past the servants gathered nearby. Mercia stormed onto the sprawling balcony, made it her stage, and as the Princess of Darkness bellowed at her subjects, demanding absolute silence. Grinning, the girl told the gathered demons the hero no longer threatened them and shouted they'd reclaimed their freedom. Mercia snapped that new dangers could still rise, so the Princess of Darkness declared she's setting off on a journey with a hero from another world, Raz Raleigh. The Princess of Darkness's subjects clustered in hushed, worried whispers, and Mercia smiled, certain of one thing: they should be worried. The Princess of Darkness flashed a smile and promised they had nothing to fear. She would leave someone for Mercia to pass her wisdom to. One girl held out her hand and beckoned her sister over, and the sister answered with a confident nod. Mercia announced that while she was away, she'd handed every last scrap of power to her younger sister Shishil. The Princess of Darkness admitted the girl still has much to learn, but already outshines her in politics, and when Mercia bellowed to the assembly for any dissenters, the room answered with complete silence. Princess of Darkness spun to Shishil and declared it was time to greet everyone. The girl bowed and agreed. Shishil thundered for every demon to listen. The princess admitted she wasn't as kind as her sister, and Shishil warned that, with Mercia gone, they must redouble their efforts. After a short speech, Shishil pinned her subjects with a bone-chilling glare and demanded if they understood everything. The assembled demons froze in horror and croaked a shaky yes. Mercy raced back to Shishil, eyes wide and blurted. Did the girl go too far? Days passed since Mercy had shrunk and shivered in the cold. She glared at the man and demanded what they'd do now and why they were adrift in the middle of the ocean, and Razel snapped that they were studying the magic of self-enhancement. Mercia's brow tightened at the sudden shift. She snapped, "Is Razel really talking about self-reinforcement?" He confirmed it, then raised his hand and told the girl to step back a little. A magic circle erupted beneath Razel's feet, blazing with searing light. She narrowed her gaze and realized he'd need more time than usual to cast it. The next moment, a blinding flash ripped through the air and seared the space right in front of her. Mercier froze as something materialized before her. She exhaled a puzzled sigh and asked, "What is it?" Then a piercing scream tore through the air. A colossal creature loomed before the Princess of Darkness, and a girl shrieked in horror, "Is that really a dragon?" Mercia gasped, eyes wide, so turning into a dragon is really self-empowerment. She demanded, baffled at how anyone could cast magic with such a hulking body. Razel, all scales and grin, rumbled that he'd expected she'd notice. Razel shot a finger up in a crisp yes and declared everything here was far more interesting. Mercia blinked, puzzled, and asked what he meant. She didn't understand. Then a blinding flash erupted, forcing her to slam a hand over her eyes. Mercy announced he'd returned to human form. Razel pressed a hand to his chest and urged the girl to take a closer look at his body. She narrowed her eyes, suspicion slicing her voice as she demanded he explain his words. The girl answered stone cold. The quality of the magical essence had shifted. Mercia assumed it belonged to a dragon, and the girl added that Razel was currently using a human form spell. He was using magic to switch between dragon and human, and she realized it was happening right then. He let out a lazy, confident sigh and smiled, saying he had no doubts about Mercia. She rubbed her nose smugly and nodded. Razel jabbed a pointed question at Mercia. What were the advantages and disadvantages of casting that magic simultaneously? And she inwardly scowled, annoyed he was asking questions again. She paused, then shot back that if they slipped into a dragon's hulking body, any delicate magical finesse would be crushed, while a human shell couldn't channel the raw, devastating spells a dragon can. Then she froze, eyes widening, and whispered, "Now I understand." Mercia burst out, thrilled, explaining Razel hadn't canceled the transformation. He'd simply draped a human form over the dragon, so there were no drawbacks. Razel smiled and confirmed, saying his body still packed dragon strength and his huge size didn't stop him from controlling magic. She pursed her lips and snapped that everything was clear. Another hard confirmation. Then the truth hit. The first rule to becoming a dragon is you must first slay a dragon, a prerequisite she hadn't even considered. Mercia's voice trembled as she asked if she could master such an advanced technique. Razel jabbed a finger at her nose and snapped, "You're saying that again." Mercia let out a surprised sigh. Razel thundered that dragons brim with boundless magic. The man pulled it off only by fusing with the hero's power, then revealed the girl already held that force, and shouted that it's what makes her unique. He drew a steadying breath and told Mercia she'd always lacked self-confidence. She only sighed, a small flash of displeasure, and Razel suspected years of oppression had taught her to belittle herself. Razel fixed a gentle gaze on Mercia and unfolded how a whisper of self-doubt can erupt into a storm of uncertainty, while Mercia stood rapt, hanging on every word of the guy in front of her. Razel flashed a grin and vowed his job as her teacher was to spark her self-confidence. Mercia shot the guy an apologetic smile, apologized, and confessed she was counting on him. He locked eyes with Mercia and told her she had to master the technique of self-reinforcement first. Mercia whooped with joy and agreed, and Razel watched her, pleased at how good her mood was. Razel insisted that in that case Mercia must wear the bracelet, then produced a tiny gleaming trinket. Mercia blinked and asked what it was. He said it would help her train to control magic. She slipped it on, sighed in admiration, and staring at the band called him handsome. Razel screamed, convinced this bracelet would finally let her master the technique. Mercia shouted back, beaming, "I'll try my best." After a long while, the demon lord's castle brooded in darkness as a hulking moon climbed over the city. Razel planted himself at a small table, eyes locked on something on his screen right in front of him. He fixed him with a sharp stare, released a slow, thoughtful sigh, and extended a single finger toward him. Then someone suddenly yelled his name, and he blinked in mild surprise. Mercia barreled up, calling Razel with a wide grin and breathlessly shouting that she'd finally gotten it to work, the girl beaming with pure joy. Mercia planted herself before him, a satisfied grin on her face shot, "How is it?" and cried for him to look at her. Razel sighed in surprise, admitted it was true, then burst out, "It's amazing." After a while, Razel and Mercia walked into a strange new place and froze at a towering, castle-like structure. As Razel's mind raced to figure out why it was here, and Mercia's jaw dropped. Could someone really be living on the moon? The guy and the girl rocketed toward the place. Rai's mind snapped to the single problem, how to get them inside. They spotted a tiny entrance and froze in curiosity. The girl locked eyes with him, sure it had been left open for anyone to slip in, and surprise hit Razel so hard he resolved it wasn't a problem anymore. Mercia crouched, scanned the entrance, and scowled. she spotted something lurking inside. The girl warned it could be a trap. Rizal shook his head and said he sensed no hostility. Razel and Mercy resolved to close the gap. The guy snarled they'd never catch the tiger cub without storming the tiger's lair, so they had to go, and the girl agreed in a heartbeat. Razel jerked to a stop. Mercia's face slammed into the back of the man ahead, and she poked her head out from behind him, snapping, "Why did you stop?" She froze, staring ahead. There was real air and the scent of grass here, and bewildered she snapped, "What is this all about?" Before them stretched a vast field, and at its center a towering tree loomed. The girl gasped, voice cracking as she demanded, "What is that?" Razel's voice stayed ice calm as he told the girl this was a created space. Mercier blinked, words tangled with confusion. "A place like that needs monstrous magic. I don't think there's anyone in the world who could pull it off." He whipped to Mercia and snapped that it wasn't human, and at that exact moment someone materialized behind them and asked what they needed. Mercia and Razel snapped around, faces hard as stone. The girl flashed a smile and said nobody had come to greet them, so they strode inside alone, and the unknown young man shrugged, admitting he'd been too lazy to step outside. Razel's eyes pinned the young man as a draconian, undeniably powerful, while the kid yawned, faced the guests and demanded, then demanded again, what they wanted here. Mercy flashed a grin, declared the youth's strength obvious, and challenged him to a fight. Razel watched from the sidelines smiling, and the draconian stood there, utterly baffled. He snorted, then burst into laughter. The young man declared they wouldn't waste time on a surprise attack. The girl charged them head-on, and he shouted that he loved fighters this blunt. No mercy, though shame pricked at him. She clenched her jaw, forced her breath steady, then hurled the question at the draconian, "Do you accept the challenge?" And the young man squared his shoulders, answering with a firm, consenting nod. He fixed his guests with a hungry stare and challenged, "Who will be first?" Razel and Mercia bristled at the sudden shift. A girl announced the young man was shockingly strong, and Razel nodded, saying they'd finally found someone truly powerful. Mercia flashed a grin and asked the young man if they could attack 2-on-1 if he didn't mind, and the draconian, awestruck, admitted he hadn't had that chance in several thousand years, glee exploding through him at the thought of finally having some fun. Mercia and Razel shot off, and the young man followed their lead, tearing after them. The draconian thrust out a taloned hand and growled that they could start. The girl vowed they wouldn't hold back. Razel flashed a grin at her and said, "This'll be fun." Explosions ripped through the air, a fierce battle erupted, and Mercia found herself ringed by crashing blasts. In a heartbeat, the young man rocketed backward, soaring out of the attack's path as an explosion tore through the spot he'd just vacated. In the blink of an eye, the draconian was behind the girl. He locked eyes, snapped "Don't yawn," waved his hand, then unleashed a brutal punch with his fist. The strike fizzled out. The young man sighed with a smile and asked Razel if he'd pulled off replacing the girl, grinning that it was pretty good. Razel stood before him with the barrier shattered, smiling. The hand slammed shut as black energy coiled around it. The young man's gaze snapped to her. Stunned, the draconian's movements pinned and crippled, and he wondered if that was exactly what the guy had been trying to achieve. The draconian swept his arm in a feral grin and roared that no petty trifle could bind his movements. Then his gaze snapped to the girl standing beside him. He whipped around in a scowl and spat a curse. He hadn't even noticed her slip up behind him, and he still couldn't pinpoint where Mercia was. In an instant, a hidden strike slammed into his back, and a crushing, dense surge of magic froze his limbs. The draconian gasped, a pained sigh escaping as he realized he wouldn't make it in time. Razel seized the moment and lunged. The young man slipped the strike, dropped into a seated guard, then unleashed a lightning-fast counterattack at Razel. The draconian's fist slammed into the man. He flashed a grin and said, "Just as I thought, Razel's magic takes the form of a dragon," and Razel shrugged, "I'm only practicing." Scales erupted across the draconian's hand. He snapped, "Not again," and feared the guy meant to render him completely immobile, so he cursed Razel. The guy just sighed with a smile. Mercia burst from behind the draconian and drove her foot into him. Razel snarled that dragons lose their heads the instant battle erupts. That's their weakness. Draconian snapped around, a grin splitting his face, and said, "This should be a kick." In that instant, a brutal blow cracked across his face, hurling him backward as a raw scream tore from his throat, and blood splattered across his features. Razel loomed over the young man, grinning as he declared this was far from over. Then the attacker lunged again, driving his hand straight through the young man's body. A draconian, a gaping hole torn through his body, plummeted from on high as a guy and a girl watched, and he slammed into the ground with a deafening bang. The draconian lay crumpled, wounds gaping, and with a defeated rasp suddenly blurted that Razel and Mercia were from another world. The guy and the girl froze, shock ripping through them. Razel closed on the dragon and demanded if he'd really noticed this. The young man shot back a firm yes, insisting their dress gave them away at once, and the draconian rumbled that he wanted to teach the guy his technique. Reisel's jaw dropped when he realized it was his. The draconian snorted and taunted that he'd feared his princess of darkness wasn't agile enough, and the girl nodded, shame burning her cheeks. The draconian fixed him with a sly, toothy grin and asked if he'd grant his final wish. Reisel's eyes snapped to Mercia, who answered with a warm smile and a single, decisive nod. Reisel sank to one knee before the young man and nodded fiercely. The young man seized the draconian's hand as a burst of crackling energy engulfed them. A grin split his face as he said everything had worked out, and with the last of his strength, the young man gasped that he was so glad to have fought such strong people. It had been so much fun. After that, the young man shut his eyes and went utterly still, a soft smile clinging to his lips. Mercia spun to Reisel and asked, "Is he dead?" And Reisel gave a curt nod, yes. She gasped, still unable to believe anyone could be that strong. Reisel replied the young man had poured his entire life into honing his skills. A sour hush dropped over Mercia, displeasure thick in the air. The girl suspected the man had jabbed her with a syringe. The Princess of Darkness whirled to Reisel and demanded he listen. Reisel fired back, "What happened?" Mercia shoved the question harder, "Why did you kill the draconian?" And said the battle's outcome was already decided, so killing him wasn't necessary. The girl asked if that was true, and Reisel faltered for a heartbeat. Mercia shot the question at them. Was the draconian the strongest in the world, and wouldn't it be smarter to win him over? But Reisel thrust a hand out to stop her, saying she'd understand everything once she saw the technique the young man had given him, and the girl pressed him to explain exactly what he meant. A bolt of realization slammed into her, and she snapped at the man to wait a second, then, stunned, demanded what technique he'd given Reisel. The man laughed, and Reisel said, "It's called the resurrection of the dead," leaving Mercia's breath to hitch in shock. She unleashed a barrage of curses at the draconian, spitting lizard, before screaming at Reisel to resurrect the young man, vowing she'd strangle him again with her own hands. Reisel laughed and taunted, "You're caught."